Who were the Celts? For centuries, the name has conjured images of mysterious warriors, intricate art, and ancient languages. Yet the people behind the term did not call themselves by a single shared name, and they were never one unified nation. Instead, they were a mosaic of communities, spread from the Atlantic coast to the heart of Anatolia, linked by certain languages, artistic traditions, and networks of exchange. Their story stretches across more than 2,000 years, from the first recognizably Celtic cultures in the early Iron Age to the modern revival of Celtic languages and identities. Along the way, they confronted empires, navigated migration and trade, and reshaped their societies in response to conquest, religion, and shifting political landscapes. This documentary will follow that journey step by step, beginning in the Bronze Age foundations, tracing the rise of Hallstatt and Tène cultures, through the shocks of Roman expansion, the endurance of Celtic traditions in Ireland and Brittany, and the transformations of the medieval and modern worlds. When we talk about the Celts today, we often imagine a single ancient people with a shared culture, speaking the same language, and living under a common identity. Yet history is rarely so simple. The word Celt is not something we find written on ancient monuments or declared in the laws of a single unified kingdom. Instead, it is a name first recorded by outsiders, Greek and Roman writers, describing groups of people they encountered or heard about, scattered across wide areas of Europe. The term itself, and the way it has been used over time, is at the heart of one of history's most enduring puzzles. Who exactly were the Celts? The earliest written reference to people called Keltoi comes from the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century before the Common Era. He placed them somewhere near the source of the Danube River, far to the northwest of the Greek world. Later Greek writers, such as Hecataeus of Miletus and Ephorus, expanded on this, describing Keltoi living in lands beyond the Pillars of Heracles in what is now southern France and Spain. The Greeks were not describing a single nation. Instead, they were grouping together different tribes they considered foreign and distinct, based on geography, customs, and perhaps some linguistic similarities. The Romans also used a similar approach, though they had their own words. Latin authors wrote of Celtae, Galli, and sometimes Belgae. Julius Caesar, in his famous account Commentari de Bello Gallico, distinguished between the Gauls in general and a subgroup he specifically called the Celtae, who, he claimed, lived in central Gaul and called themselves by that name. It is important to note that Caesar was writing for political and propaganda purposes. His divisions between Gauls, Celtae, and Belgae may have reflected real differences, but they also served his own narrative, portraying some tribes as more civilized and others as more barbaric, depending on the alliances he wanted to form or the enemies he wished to defeat. These ancient terms were never consistently applied. Greek geographers might call a group Keltoi, while a Roman writer called the same people Galli. In some cases, the label Celt covered communities who never met each other, separated by hundreds of miles and very different ways of life. This loose and inconsistent naming is one reason historians today are cautious when using the word Celt to describe ancient peoples. Modern archaeology and linguistics add another layer to the question. The languages we call Celtic form a branch of the wider Indo-European language family. This branch includes ancient tongues like Gaulish, Celtiberian, and Lepontic, as well as the medieval and modern languages of Irish, Welsh, Breton, and others. Linguists can trace common features among these languages, such as certain sound shifts and shared vocabulary, suggesting they all developed from a common ancestral language spoken perhaps in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. But language boundaries do not always match cultural or political boundaries. Just because two tribes spoke related languages did not mean they saw themselves as part of a single people. Archaeologists also look for patterns in material culture. Art styles, pottery shapes, burial practices, tools, and weapons. Two major archaeological cultures, the Hallstatt culture and the Tène culture, have long been linked to the spread of early Celtic languages. The Hallstatt culture flourished in Central Europe from around the 8th to the 5th centuries before the Common Era, followed by the Latin culture from the 5th century until the Roman conquests. These cultures produced distinctive art and elite goods, and their influence spread widely across Europe. However, linking these archaeological patterns directly to language or identity is not straightforward. People can adopt art styles or technologies from their neighbors without speaking the same language or thinking of themselves as one group. The difficulty becomes clearer when we look at specific examples. In the Iberian Peninsula, for instance, some tribes spoke Celtic languages, others spoke non-Celtic Indo-European languages, and still others spoke languages unrelated to Indo-European altogether. Yet, in Roman records, several of these groups might all be described under broad labels like Hispani or Celtiberi. In northern Italy, inscriptions in the Lepontic language, considered an early Celtic language, appear alongside evidence of interaction with Etruscans and Italic peoples. In the British Isles, by the late Iron Age, most inhabitants likely spoke forms of insular Celtic languages, but their political organization, art, and trade connections varied greatly between regions. The modern use of the word Celt has its own history, shaped by scholarship, politics, and cultural revival movements. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European antiquarians began to identify the ancient Gauls and Britons with the term Celtic, drawing on classical sources and early linguistic studies. By the 19th century, Celtic had become a cultural and romantic idea, especially in places like Ireland, Wales, and Brittany, where people sought to assert distinct identities within larger states. This modern Celtic identity often drew on symbols, myths, and art styles inspired by Iron Age finds, even though the historical continuity from ancient times was complex and sometimes broken. One famous example of this romanticizing is the use of Latin art motifs, spirals, triskelies, and intricate knotwork in 19th-century decorative arts, particularly during the Celtic revival in Ireland and Scotland. These designs were inspired by archaeological discoveries, but were often reimagined in new contexts. The revival movements emphasized a shared heritage across Celtic-speaking regions, even if that shared heritage was reconstructed from fragments of the past. Historians and archaeologists today are careful to separate the different layers of meaning attached to the word Celt. There is the linguistic sense, speakers of Celtic languages past and present. There is the archaeological sense, cultures like Hallstatt and Tène that share certain material traits. And there is the modern cultural sense, communities that identify as Celtic in the present day, whether or not they have a continuous connection to ancient peoples. These layers overlap in places, but they are not the same. Understanding this complexity matters because it shapes how we tell the history of the Celts. If we imagine them as a single people with a single origin, we risk flattening out the rich diversity of communities that lived under that broad label. If we focus only on the archaeological cultures, we might overlook the role of language and oral traditions. And if we only look at the modern Celtic nations, we might miss the vast geographic spread of Celtic languages and cultures in the ancient world, from the Atlantic coast to the highlands of Anatolia. The challenge of defining Celt is not just an academic problem. It also affects how people today connect with this history. In Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Brittany, the idea of being Celtic is tied to language revival, music, and festivals. In Spain, regions like Galicia and Asturias sometimes draw on ancient Celtic connections as part of their cultural identity. For descendants of immigrants in North America, Australia, and elsewhere, Celtic often means a shared heritage that crosses national borders. These connections are meaningful, but they are built on selective readings of the past, combining archaeology, linguistics, and cultural imagination. In the end, perhaps the most accurate way to think about the Celts in history is as a network, not a nation. In the Iron Age, these networks were made up of communities that spoke related languages, shared certain artistic and technological traditions, and traded or fought with one another across long distances. The boundaries were fluid, and identities could shift over time. Some groups became more integrated into neighboring cultures, while others moved into new regions entirely. carrying their language and traditions with them. Recognizing this complexity allows us to see the Celts not as a single story, but as many interconnected stories. These stories include the rise of powerful chieftains in the Hallstatt heartlands, the migrations and art of the Tène period, the encounters with Mediterranean powers, and the adaptations under Roman rule. By starting with the question, who were the Celts? We open the door to a layered and dynamic history, one that will take us from the earliest European Iron Age to the cultural revivals of the modern world. From here, our journey will turn to the period before anyone was called Celt at all, to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age foundations that made the later Celtic world possible. Before the first Greek historians wrote of the Keltoi, and long before Julius Caesar described the Celtae, the ancestors of those later communities were living in a Europe already full of change. To understand how the societies that would later be called Celtic came into being, we must step back into the centuries before the name itself existed, into the late Bronze Age and the earliest centuries of the Iron Age. This was a world without centralized states in much of Europe, yet it was bound together by networks of trade, craft, and migration. It was in this period, roughly from the 12th century before the Common Era to the early 8th century before the Common Era, that the cultural and technological foundations for later Celtic societies were laid. The late Bronze Age in Europe was an era of metal, movement, and exchange. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, had been used for centuries for tools, weapons, and ornaments. But bronze was not made from raw materials found everywhere. Copper came from places such as the Alps, the Balkans, and parts of the British Isles. Tin was rarer still, found in notable quantities in Cornwall, Brittany, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula. This meant that the making of bronze depended on long-distance trade, linking communities separated by hundreds of miles. The routes that carried these metals also carried ideas, art styles, and technologies. During this time, elite warriors and chieftains controlled much of the metal trade. Archaeologists have uncovered hoards, collections of weapons, tools, and ornaments buried in the ground that suggest both ritual offerings and wealth storage. Many of these hoards contain objects of foreign origin, indicating that goods were moving across vast distances. Swords made in one region turn up far away, while ornaments of a specific style appear in areas where they were never produced. This flow of goods created a shared visual language among elites, even in communities that spoke different languages or had different customs. The 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era also saw major upheavals around the Mediterranean. The collapse of the Mycenaean palaces in Greece, the decline of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and disruptions to trade routes that had linked the Aegean, Egypt, and the Near East. Some historians call this the Bronze Age collapse. While the heartlands of later Celtic Europe were far to the north and west of these events, the disruptions rippled outward. Trade patterns shifted, and inland routes became more important as coastal powers faltered. Communities in Central and Western Europe were able to develop greater autonomy and new trading connections, particularly along river systems like the Danube, the Rhine, and the Rhone. One of the distinctive features of the late Bronze Age in Europe is the spread of fortified hilltop settlements. These were not cities in the classical sense, but they were centers of craft production, storage, and defense. Located on high ground, they gave commanding views of the surrounding landscape and could be easily defended in times of conflict. Many were strategically positioned along trade routes or near valuable resources like salt deposits. Salt was a key commodity, essential for preserving food, and regions with rich salt mines, such as Hallstatt in present-day Austria, became centers of wealth and influence. The late Bronze Age also saw significant advances in craftsmanship. Metalworkers produced swords with leaf-shaped blades, socketed spearheads, and intricately decorated shields. Gold ornaments, torques, bracelets, and diadems appeared in elite burials, signaling both wealth and status. The designs often featured geometric patterns, spirals, and stylized animal motifs that would later evolve into the more complex curvilinear art of the Iron Age. By the 10th and 9th centuries before the Common Era, iron began to appear in Europe. At first it was rare and often reserved for high-status items like decorated blades or ceremonial weapons. But iron had one major advantage over bronze. It could be made from ore deposits found in many parts of Europe, reducing the dependence on long-distance tin trade. As techniques for smelting and forging iron improved, it began to replace bronze for tools and weapons. This transition marks the beginning of the Iron Age, which in Central Europe is usually dated to around the 8th century before the Common Era. The introduction of iron technology was not just a change in materials, it transformed economies, warfare, and daily life. Iron tools allowed farmers to clear land more efficiently, plow heavier soils, and produce surplus crops. This in turn supported population growth and more complex social hierarchies. Iron weapons, swords, spears, and arrowheads were stronger and more durable than their bronze counterparts, giving an advantage to those who could equip their warriors with them. Communities with access to iron-working skills gained military and economic power, enabling them to dominate their neighbors or control trade routes. It was in this dynamic environment that the seeds of later Celtic cultures were sown. Central Europe, especially the regions around the Upper Danube and the Alps, became a crossroads of interaction. To the south lay the Etruscan cities of northern Italy and the Greek colonies along the Mediterranean coasts of France and Spain. To the north and west stretched the river valleys and Atlantic shores of Gaul, Britain, and Ireland. Traders and migrants carried not just goods, but also ideas, new ways of building, farming, fighting, and ruling. By the early Iron Age, distinct cultural zones were beginning to emerge in Europe. In the West, communities along the Atlantic seaboard shared certain burial practices and styles of metalwork, while in the Central European uplands, the Hallstatt culture was taking shape. In Iberia, the fusion of local traditions with influences from Phoenician and Greek traders was creating a distinctive cultural mix. These zones were not isolated from one another. They overlapped and interacted, exchanging both goods and cultural practices. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing signs of social stratification. Elite burials from the early Iron Age contain rich grave goods, chariots, feasting sets, imported wine jars that speak of leaders who commanded significant resources. Such displays of wealth and power suggest organized societies with hierarchies and perhaps early forms of political centralization. These leaders likely played a key role in maintaining trade networks and in patronizing the craftspeople whose work reinforced their status. Language during this period is harder to trace, as no written records survive from the communities in question. However, based on the later distribution of Celtic languages and the patterns of cultural exchange, many scholars believe that the ancestral form of Proto-Celtic may have been spoken in some of these Central European regions by the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. As trade, migration, and conquest spread cultural traits, so too may the early Celtic languages have spread, adapting to local contexts along the way. What is striking about the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age is the level of connectivity across such a large area without the presence of empires or centralized states. The Mediterranean had its great city-states and kingdoms, but in much of Europe, power was local, rooted in kin groups, warrior elites, and control of resources. Yet these small-scale societies were linked together in a web of exchanges, of goods, technologies, and cultural symbols that stretched from the Atlantic to the Carpathians. This web created the conditions for certain cultural traits to spread widely and for linguistic communities to expand over large distances. By the close of the early Iron Age, around the 6th century before the Common Era, the groundwork for the rise of more distinct cultural horizons like the Hallstatt and Tène traditions was complete. Communities in Central Europe were producing art and artifacts that would later be recognized as Celtic in style, and trade links with the Mediterranean were growing stronger. Wealthy leaders controlled fortified centers, hosted feasts that reinforced alliances, and exchanged gifts with distant partners. The societies that emerged from this environment would go on to leave a far more visible mark on the archaeological and historical record. The world of the late Bronze Age to early Iron Age was one of transition, between materials, between trade systems, and between cultural horizons. It was not yet the world of the named Celts, but it was the soil from which that world would grow. By the dawn of the 8th century before the Common Era, the societies of Central Europe had undergone centuries of change. They had moved from bronze to iron, from loosely connected networks of exchange to increasingly stratified communities with powerful elites. It was in this environment that the first archaeologically distinct horizon clearly linked with the ancestors of later Celtic-speaking peoples emerged, the Hallstatt culture. Named after the site of Hallstatt in modern-day Austria, this cultural complex stretched across a wide swathe of Central Europe, from eastern France to western Hungary, and from the Alps northward into parts of what is now Germany and the Czech Republic. The Hallstatt culture takes its name from a remarkable salt mining settlement and burial site near Lake Hallstatt. Salt had been extracted here since the late Bronze Age, but in the early Iron Age, mining intensified and became the foundation for significant local wealth. Salt was one of the most valuable commodities of the ancient world, essential for preserving meat and fish and prized across Europe. Control of rich salt deposits gave the Hallstatt elites both economic and political leverage over trade routes stretching hundreds of miles. One of the most striking features of the Hallstatt period is the emergence of what archaeologists call princely burials. These graves belonged to elite individuals, likely chieftains or rulers, and contained lavish goods that signaled their status and connections. Burials such as those at Hochdorf in modern-day Germany and Vix in modern-day France included finely crafted weapons, gold ornaments, decorated drinking vessels, and imported luxury goods from the Mediterranean. At Hochdorf, the body of a man over 6 feet tall was laid out on a bronze couch with wheels, surrounded by gold jewelry, drinking horns, and a massive cauldron capable of holding hundreds of liters of liquid. The Vix grave, discovered in the 20th century, contained a monumental bronze crater from Greece, standing taller than most people and weighing hundreds of pounds. These imported items reveal much about Hallstatt society. They show that its elites were deeply involved in long-distance trade, exchanging raw materials and possibly slaves or mercenaries for luxury goods from Greek and Etruscan cities. The presence of fine Mediterranean wine-drinking sets in Central European burials suggests that feasting and drinking ceremonies were important arenas for displaying status and reinforcing political alliances. These feasts were not mere indulgences. They were tools of power, occasions where leaders demonstrated their ability to provide exotic goods and maintain connections far beyond their local territories. The political geography of the Hallstatt world was not that of a unified state. Instead, it seems to have been a patchwork of chiefdoms, each centered on a fortified settlement or hill fort. Many of these hill forts occupied strategic positions along rivers or passes, allowing their rulers to control and tax trade. Sites like Hüneberg on the upper Danube show evidence of planned layouts, defensive walls, and specialized craft production. At Hüneberg, archaeologists have found remnants of mud brick walls built in a Mediterranean style, likely the work of foreign artisans or locals imitating southern techniques. This suggests that some Hallstatt elites aspired to Mediterranean forms of architecture and urban planning. The Hallstatt culture is often divided into 2 main phases: Hallstatt A and B, late Bronze Age to early Iron Age, and Hallstatt C and D, the mature and later phases of the culture, roughly 7th to 5th centuries before the Common Era. The earlier phases show a gradual transition from Bronze Age traditions, while the later phases reveal fully developed elite networks, complex burial rites, and an artistic style that blended geometric precision with emerging curvilinear motifs. One important feature of Hallstatt society was its social hierarchy. The richly furnished graves belonged to a small minority, suggesting that power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of a few ruling families. Most people lived in small farming communities, working the land and producing surplus goods that supported the elite lifestyle. Archaeological finds of iron tools, sickles, and plow parts show that agriculture was productive and capable of sustaining large populations. Livestock, especially horses, played an important role both economically and symbolically. Horses were often buried alongside their owners, signifying their role in elite warfare and prestige. Warfare in the Hallstatt period was shaped by the adoption of iron weaponry. Swords, spears, and daggers were common finds in warrior burials, often accompanied by ornate helmets and shields. Some helmets were crafted with intricate designs and crests, serving as much to display status as to protect in battle. The presence of chariots in some graves also points to a martial elite who valued mobility and spectacle. In the Hallstatt world, power rested on a combination of military might, control of trade, and the ability to command labor for large-scale projects. Religious beliefs in the Hallstatt period remain partly mysterious, as there are no written records from the people themselves. However, the burial customs and placement of offerings suggest a belief in an afterlife where status and possessions continued to matter. The careful arrangement of grave goods, the inclusion of feasting equipment, and the sacrifice of animals all point to complex ritual practices. Some scholars have suggested that certain sites with large accumulations of weapons or ornaments might have been sanctuaries where offerings were made to deities or spirits. Art in the Hallstatt culture combined influences from older Bronze Age traditions with new elements from the Mediterranean. Geometric patterns, zigzags, and concentric circles were common, often incised into metalwork or pottery. Gradually, more fluid and curved designs began to appear, motifs that would later flourish in the Tène style. Objects such as fibulae, brooches used to fasten clothing, often carried both practical and decorative value, reflecting the craftsmanship of local artisans. The Hallstatt world began to change in the 5th century before the Common Era. Archaeologists see signs of a shift in trade routes, partly due to the rise of Greek colonies along the southern coast of France and increased competition from other emerging powers in Europe. The old centers of Hallstatt power in the Alpine and Danubian regions began to decline, while new cultural and political hubs emerged further to the northwest. This transition marks the beginning of the Tène culture, which would come to dominate the European Iron Age and be more directly linked in the historical record with peoples called Celts by ancient authors. The reasons for the transformation from Hallstatt to Tène are still debated. Some point to economic changes, such as the decline in the value of certain trade goods or the opening of new routes that bypassed the old centers. Others suggest that internal social tensions or external pressures from migrating groups played a role. Whatever the causes, the result was a cultural shift that saw the old princely burials replaced by new forms of expression, and the art of Central Europe take on a more dynamic, curvilinear style. The Hallstatt culture stands as the first clearly identifiable archaeological horizon that we can connect, with caution, to the early Celtic-speaking world. It represents a stage when Central European elites were deeply engaged with the Mediterranean, commanding wealth and power through control of resources like salt and iron. It also shows the beginnings of the artistic and social patterns that would characterize later Celtic societies. The Hallstatt period was, in many ways, the foundation on which the more widely recognized Tène culture would build, transforming the networks, art, and power structures of Central Europe into something both new and enduring. By the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, the cultural and political landscape of Central Europe had shifted. The grand hill forts and princely burials of the Hallstatt elites no longer dominated the archaeological record in the same way. In their place emerged a new cultural horizon that would define the European Iron Age for centuries, the Tène culture. Named after the site of Tène on the northern shore of Lake Neuchâtel in present-day Switzerland, this cultural complex produced some of the most distinctive art, weaponry, and material culture of the ancient world. The Tène period marks a transformation in both style and scope. Its origins lie partly in the old Hallstatt traditions, but the visual and social world of Tène was different, more fluid, more interconnected, and more outward-looking. This was a period when communities in Central Europe began to move, settle, and trade far beyond their traditional homelands. In doing so, they carried their languages, technologies, and art across vast stretches of the continent, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Carpathians, and from the British Isles to the fringes of Anatolia. One of the most striking features of the Tène culture is its art. The curvilinear style with flowing lines, spirals, S-shapes, and vegetal motifs marked a departure from the geometric rigidity of the Hallstatt period. This was art in motion, dynamic, often asymmetrical, and full of energy. Weapons, jewelry, and even everyday objects were adorned with these intricate patterns. Metalworkers experimented with inlays of coral, enamel, and glass, producing a vibrant color palette to complement the fine metalwork. The designs often drew on a mixture of influences. Elements from the Mediterranean, Greek, Etruscan, and later Roman were reinterpreted in new ways. A Greek vine motif, for instance, might be transformed into an abstract spiral pattern, losing its naturalistic form but gaining a new visual rhythm. This ability to absorb and adapt external influences was a hallmark of Tène creativity. The expansion of Tène culture was not simply the spread of an art style, it reflected profound changes in mobility and interaction. Archaeologists find Tène-style objects in areas far from the Central European heartland, suggesting both trade and migration. In some cases, these finds coincide with evidence of entire communities moving into new territories. Historical sources from the Mediterranean world record raids, mercenary service, and even large-scale migrations of peoples from the lands north of the Alps into Italy, the Balkans, and beyond. This movement was driven by several factors. One was the search for land and resources. As populations grew, pressure on local farmland may have pushed younger or ambitious leaders to seek opportunities elsewhere. Another was the lure of wealth from the Mediterranean economies. Contact with Greek colonies in southern France, Etruscan cities in northern Italy, and later, with the expanding Roman Republic, brought access to luxury goods, coinage, and lucrative military service. Celtic warriors became known as fierce fighters, and some were hired as mercenaries by Mediterranean powers. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Tène groups were active across much of Gaul, in the Iberian Peninsula, and in northern Italy. In Italy, Celtic groups, known to the Romans as Gauls, established themselves in the Po Valley, displacing or assimilating earlier Etruscan and Italic populations. They founded settlements, controlled trade routes, and occasionally clashed with Rome, setting the stage for later conflicts. In the east, Tène influence reached into the Carpathian Basin and the Balkans. Some groups moved along the Danube corridor, engaging in both trade and raiding. By the early 3rd century before the Common Era, Celtic warbands would push even further into the Greek world itself in events we will explore in later sections. The social structure of Tène communities appears to have been more flexible than in the Hallstatt period. While powerful elites still existed, the evidence suggests a more warrior-centered society. Rich burials from this period often contain weapons, swords, spears, and shields, alongside ornaments like torques and brooches. These warrior graves were not limited to a tiny princely class, indicating that status could be gained through martial skill as well as inheritance. Fortified oppida, large enclosed settlements, began to appear in the later Tène period, especially in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. These were centers of trade, craft production, and political administration, often strategically located near rivers or crossroads. The scale of some oppida suggests coordinated labor and planning, and their distribution across Europe shows the reach of Tène networks. However, in the earlier centuries of the culture, mobility and dispersed settlements seem to have been more common. One notable technological feature of the Tène period was the refinement of iron weaponry and tools. Swords were longer and more effective for slashing in close combat. Spears and javelins were standardized in design, suggesting organized production. Shields became more sophisticated, with wooden cores and metal fittings that could be both functional and decorative. Horse gear, including bits and harness fittings, was also common in elite burials, pointing to the continued importance of cavalry in warfare and prestige. Religion and belief systems in the Latin world are glimpsed through archaeology and the accounts of Greek and Roman writers. Sacred sites often included deposits of weapons, jewelry, and animal remains, possibly offerings to deities or spirits. Water, in particular, seems to have held special significance. Many ritual deposits have been found in lakes, rivers, and bogs. Classical authors like Posidonius and later Julius Caesar described druids and other religious specialists among the Gauls, but these accounts reflect the situation in the 1st century before the Common Era, long after the early Latin period began. One important aspect of Latin expansion was cultural interaction. In regions like the Iberian Peninsula, Latin material culture mingled with that of local peoples, creating hybrid forms. In Britain and Ireland, Latin styles were adopted and adapted to insular traditions, influencing art and metalwork for centuries. In the Balkans, Celtic settlers interacted with Thracian and Illyrian communities, leaving their mark in both language and material culture. The Latin period also saw the introduction of coinage in many Celtic regions. Initially inspired by Greek and Macedonian designs, these coins were often copied and then transformed into local styles. Some featured abstracted versions of classical images, while others used entirely new symbols. The spread of coinage reflects the growth of market exchange and a shift towards more monetized economies, particularly in areas of close contact with the Mediterranean world. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, Latin culture dominated much of temperate Europe. Yet, it was not a single political entity. Instead, it was a patchwork of tribes and confederations, each with its own leaders and territories, but connected through trade, shared art styles, and often through shifting alliances or rivalries. This diversity allowed the culture to adapt to many different environments, but it also meant that Celtic Europe was politically fragmented, something that would later make it vulnerable to the expansion of Rome. The legacy of the Latin period is visible not only in the objects it left behind, but also in the cultural connections it created. It was during this era that Celtic languages and cultural forms reached their widest geographic spread. The mobility of Latin peoples, their skill in metalwork, and their adaptability in adopting and reshaping foreign influences made them a dynamic force in ancient Europe. As the Latin world expanded, it inevitably came into contact, and sometimes conflict, with the powerful states of the Mediterranean. These encounters would change the course of Celtic history. The first great shock to the Mediterranean powers from the Celtic world came in the early 4th century before the Common Era, when a coalition of Gauls descended upon Italy and clashed with Rome itself. That dramatic episode will be the focus of our next section. By the early 4th century before the Common Era, Latin groups were well established across much of northern Italy. Over the course of several generations, Celtic-speaking peoples, whom the Romans called Gauls, had migrated south across the Alps and settled in the fertile plains of the Po Valley. They founded communities, cultivated the rich land, and controlled important trade routes that linked the Italian peninsula to Transalpine Europe. For Rome, which was still a young republic confined largely to central Italy, the Gauls were both trading partners and a looming military threat. The events that would unfold around the year 390 before the Common Era remain among the most famous and traumatic in early Roman history. The sack of Rome by a coalition of Gauls. Our knowledge of this episode comes primarily from later Roman historians, such as Livy and Plutarch, writing centuries after the fact. While their accounts mix historical fact with legend, there is no doubt that the encounter between Rome and the Gauls left a deep and lasting scar on the Roman psyche. According to these sources, the Gauls involved in the sack of Rome belonged to the Senones, a powerful Celtic tribe that had migrated into the Adriatic coastlands of Italy. The Senones were led by a chieftain named Brennus, a name that appears in several Celtic contexts, suggesting it may have been a title rather than a personal name. Tensions between the Senones and Rome escalated after the Gauls besieged the Etruscan city of Clusium. The Clusians appealed to Rome for help, and Roman envoys were sent to mediate. However, Instead of negotiating, these envoys allegedly joined in the fighting against the Gauls, violating the rules of diplomacy. This breach of conduct enraged the Senones, who turned their attention toward Rome itself. Gathering their warriors, they marched south and met the Roman army at the river Allia, a tributary of the Tiber, in what would be remembered as the Battle of the Allia. The Romans, outnumbered and poorly prepared, suffered a devastating defeat. Many soldiers fled to the nearby city of Veii, while others retreated into the fortified heart of Rome. The road to the city was open. The Gauls entered Rome with little resistance. Most of the population had fled, leaving behind only a garrison on the Capitoline Hill. For several days, the Gauls plundered the city. One of the most enduring legends from this time tells of the sacred geese of the Temple of Juno. When the Gauls attempted a night assault on the Capitoline, the geese's alarm calls roused the defenders, who repelled the attack. Whether or not this detail is true, it reflects how the Romans later sought to find moments of heroism in an otherwise humiliating episode. Eventually, the Romans negotiated a ransom for the Gauls to withdraw. Livy reports that the payment was 1,000 pounds of gold. In one version of the story, when the Romans complained that the Gauls were using false weights, Brennus threw his sword onto the scales and declared, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. The Gauls departed, leaving Rome humiliated but still intact. The sack of Rome had consequences far beyond the immediate destruction. For the Romans, it became a foundational trauma, a warning that their city could be overrun if they were unprepared. Roman military policy and fortifications were reshaped in the decades that followed. The construction of the so-called Servian Wall, a massive circuit of stone fortifications around the city, was a direct response to the Gallic sack. The Romans also began to place greater emphasis on maintaining a citizen army ready for rapid deployment and on forging alliances that would secure their northern frontiers. For the Gauls, the sack of Rome demonstrated their military power in the Italian peninsula. Yet it did not lead to a lasting Celtic dominance over central Italy. The Senones and other Gallic tribes remained significant players in northern Italy, but their influence was limited by their fragmented political structure and by the growing strength of Rome and its allies. In the following centuries, Rome would gradually push northward, eventually conquering the Po Valley and incorporating it into the Republic. It is worth noting that Roman writers often portrayed the Gauls in a way that reinforced Roman identity. By casting the Gauls as wild, impetuous, and dangerous, they positioned Rome as disciplined, civilized, and ultimately superior. This image persisted for centuries, coloring Roman accounts of later encounters with Celtic peoples in Gaul, Spain, and Britain. The memory of the sack became a political tool, invoked by Roman leaders to justify military campaigns and to remind citizens of the need for vigilance. Archaeological evidence from this period supports the historical reality of widespread Celtic settlement in northern Italy. Latin-style weaponry, ornaments, and pottery have been found across the region, often alongside local Italic and Etruscan materials, indicating a degree of cultural exchange and integration. The Senones were not isolated invaders, but part of a broader pattern of Celtic expansion that brought new technologies, artistic styles, and social practices into contact with the Mediterranean world. The sack of Rome was not the only instance of Celtic impact on the Mediterranean during this era. Similar patterns of movement and conflict were occurring in the Balkans and along the Adriatic, where Celtic groups interacted with Greek colonies and Illyrian tribes. These movements reveal the flexibility and adaptability of Latin societies, able to establish themselves in new environments while maintaining connections to their homelands. In the longer view, the sack of Rome was an early chapter in a much larger story, the centuries-long encounter between Celtic Europe and the expanding Mediterranean powers. This encounter would shape the political and cultural map of Europe, producing both moments of intense conflict and long periods of coexistence and exchange. The Romans never forgot the lesson of the Allia and the Capitoline. When they later confronted Celtic armies in Gaul and Britain, they carried with them the memory of that early defeat, and the determination never to allow such a humiliation again. This determination would, in time, bring them into direct conflict with Celtic groups far beyond Italy. By the early 3rd century before the Common Era, the Celtic world was more mobile than ever before. From their Latin heartlands north of the Alps, Celtic-speaking peoples had already established themselves in northern Italy, clashed with Rome, and settled in regions from the Atlantic to the upper Danube. Yet their ambitions and movements did not stop at the edges of the Mediterranean. In this period, Celtic warbands began to push into southeastern Europe, crossing into the Balkans and, eventually, into the very heart of the Hellenistic world. These movements brought them into contact, and often into conflict, with the successor states of Alexander the Great's empire. The most dramatic result of this expansion was the creation of a Celtic homeland in central Anatolia, known to history as Galatia. The background to this story lies in the political landscape of the early Hellenistic period. Following the death of Alexander the Great in the year 323 before the Common Era, his vast empire fractured into a number of rival kingdoms ruled by his former generals, known as the Diadochi. These kingdoms, such as Macedon in Greece, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, were locked in a complex web of alliances and wars. Their resources and attention were often consumed by conflicts with one another, leaving some frontiers less guarded than they might otherwise have been. For ambitious Celtic leaders seeking land, wealth, and opportunities for their warriors, the Balkans and beyond presented a tempting target. Our main sources for the Celtic incursions into the Balkans are Greek historians such as Pausanias and Polybius, along with fragments from other writers. Although these accounts were written from an outsider's perspective and sometimes emphasized the barbaric nature of the Celts, they preserve valuable details about the movements of these groups. The first large-scale Celtic invasion of the Balkans is recorded in the year 280 before the Common Era. This was not a single tribe, but a coalition of different Celtic groups, possibly numbering many tens of thousands when warriors, families, and camp followers are included. The Celts advanced into Thrace and Macedonia, defeating several local forces along the way. At this time, Macedon was ruled by Ptolemy Karaunos, who had seized the throne only recently. Confident in his strength, Ptolemy underestimated the invaders and engaged them in open battle. The result was a disaster for the Macedonians. Ptolemy himself was killed, and his army scattered. The sudden death of the king plunged Macedon into political chaos, further opening the way for Celtic advances. Some Celtic contingents turned southward into Greece proper, moving toward the rich religious and cultural center of Delphi. The events that followed became part of Greek historical memory, often told in dramatic terms. According to Pausanias, the Celtic leader Brennus led an attack on Delphi in the year 279 before the Common Era, hoping to seize the treasures of the sanctuary of Apollo. However, the assault was met with fierce resistance from local Greek forces. Ancient accounts describe storms, earthquakes, and even divine intervention aiding the defenders. Whether these details were natural events or later embellishments, the outcome was clear. Brennus was wounded, and the Celtic forces were forced to retreat. Brennus is said to have taken his own life during the withdrawal, leaving his men to find their way north. Not all the Celtic groups returned to their original homelands. Many remained in the Balkans, settling in regions of Thrace and along the Danube. Others, however, took a different path, eastward, across the straits into Asia Minor. It was here that they would establish a lasting presence. The exact circumstances of their movement into Asia are not entirely clear, but it is likely that they were invited or allowed to cross by Nicomedes I, king of Bithynia, who sought to use them as allies in his own struggles against rival Hellenistic rulers. Once in Asia Minor, the Celts, by now known to the Greeks as Galatians, began to carve out territories in the central plateau. They organized themselves into 3 main tribal groups: the Tectosages, the Tolistobogi, and the Trochmi. Each group controlled its own region, but they were united by language, customs, and a warrior ethos. From their new base in central Anatolia, the Galatians became both a threat and a resource for neighboring powers. They conducted raids on Greek cities in Asia Minor, extracting tribute, but they could also be hired as mercenaries by ambitious kings. The Galatians' reputation as fierce fighters quickly spread. Hellenistic armies often included Celtic contingents, valued for their skill in shock combat and their willingness to fight for pay. Yet their presence in Asia Minor also brought them into conflict with the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the year 275 before the Common Era, Antiochus I of the Seleucid Empire decisively defeated a Galatian force in what became known as the Elephant Victory, named for his use of war elephants to terrify and scatter the Celtic warriors. This defeat did not drive the Galatians from Anatolia, but it curbed their raids and marked the beginning of their integration into the Hellenistic political order. Over the following century, the Galatians established themselves as a semi-permanent fixture in central Anatolia. They retained aspects of their Celtic cultural identity, such as language, warrior traditions, and certain artistic styles, while adapting to the political realities of their new environment. Greek and Roman writers continued to describe them in terms that emphasized their barbarian origins, but archaeological evidence suggests they also participated in the broader cultural life of Hellenistic Asia Minor. The creation of Galatia illustrates the adaptability of Celtic societies during this period. Unlike in northern Italy, where Celtic groups were eventually conquered and assimilated by Rome, the Galatians managed to maintain a distinct political and cultural identity for generations, despite being surrounded by powerful and sophisticated states. Their mobility, willingness to engage as both raiders and mercenaries, and ability to negotiate alliances allowed them to survive in a highly competitive political landscape. The story of the Galatian invasions also highlights a broader theme in Celtic history: the ability of these societies to operate far from their original homelands while retaining a sense of cohesion. Whether in the Po Valley, the Balkans, or Anatolia, Celtic groups could adapt to new environments, interact with foreign cultures, and carve out spaces for themselves in regions dominated by other powers. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Iberian Peninsula was a complex patchwork of cultures and peoples. Along the coasts, especially in the east and south, Greek and Phoenician traders had long maintained colonies, while in the interior and northern highlands, diverse tribal societies thrived. Among these inland communities were the Celtiberians, peoples who combined elements of Celtic and local Iberian traditions into a distinct cultural identity. Their lands, located mainly in the central eastern uplands of modern Spain, were far from the sea but strategically positioned between the Mediterranean coast and the rich interior plateaus. The Celtiberians were not a single unified tribe, but a collection of related groups. The Aravaci, Belli, Titi, and Lusonis are among the most prominent names preserved in ancient sources. They lived in fortified hilltop settlements known as castros or oppida, which served both as defensive refuges and as centers of local governance. These hill forts were often positioned to control valleys, river crossings, and routes through the mountains, making them difficult to assault and ideal for resisting outside powers. In terms of material culture, the Celtiberians displayed a blend of influences. Their weaponry, especially their short, double-edged swords and distinctive daggers, drew on Latin Celtic designs but adapted them for the rugged terrain and close-quarter combat common in their homelands. Their art incorporated both Celtic curvilinear motifs and Iberian geometric patterns. Pottery, textiles, and metal ornaments often carried symbolic designs that reflected both local traditions and wider connections across the Celtic world. The Roman Republic first became seriously involved in Iberia during the Second Punic War against Carthage, beginning in the late 3rd century before the Common Era. Carthage had established strongholds along the southeastern coast, using Iberian troops in its armies. Hannibal himself famously recruited Celtiberian warriors for his campaigns, including the march over the Alps into Italy. After Rome's eventual victory over Carthage, the Iberian Peninsula came under Roman influence in stages. The coastal regions were taken relatively quickly, but the interior highlands, home to the Celtiberians, proved far more resistant. The reasons for this resistance were both geographic and cultural. The upland terrain favored defense, and the Celtiberian way of life emphasized warrior values, local autonomy, and a strong attachment to the land. Roman attempts to impose control through garrisons and tribute demands were met with fierce opposition. The first major conflict between Rome and the Celtiberians began in the mid-2nd century before the Common Era, often referred to as the First Celtiberian War. This war was sparked by Roman efforts to curb the growing power of the Belli and Titi tribes, who had fortified their towns and expanded their influence. One of the focal points of this war was the Oppidum of Segeda, which the Romans accused of violating earlier agreements by enlarging its walls. The Celtiberians argued that their actions were within their rights, but the Roman Senate took a different view. In the year 153 before the Common Era, Roman forces marched into Celtiberian territory, initiating a prolonged conflict. The Celtiberians, fighting on their own ground and using guerrilla tactics, inflicted significant losses on the Romans. The war eventually ended in a negotiated peace, but tensions remained unresolved. These tensions erupted again in what became known as the Numantine War, named for the fortified city of Numantia in the territory of the Aravaci. This war, lasting from 143 to 133 before the Common Era, became legendary in Roman history as a symbol of stubborn resistance. Numantia, though small, was extraordinarily well defended by its location and by the determination of its inhabitants. Roman commanders, including the celebrated but ill-fated Quintus Pompeius and later Marcus Popilius Laenas, found themselves unable to take the city despite superior numbers. The turning point came when the Roman Senate entrusted the campaign to Scipio Aemilianus, the same general who had destroyed Carthage. Scipio brought discipline and organization to the Roman forces, avoiding direct assaults and instead constructing a complete circumvallation around Numantia. The siege cut off all supplies and slowly starved the defenders into submission. After many months, the surviving Numantines, unwilling to be paraded as captives, are said to have chosen death over surrender, either by fighting to the end or taking their own lives. The city was destroyed in 133 before the Common Era, and its fall marked the effective end of large-scale Celtiberian resistance. The consequences of these wars were profound. The destruction of Numantia and the subjugation of the other Celtiberian tribes opened the way for full Roman control over the central Iberian uplands. Rome established new colonies, redistributed land, and integrated the region into its administrative system. Over time, Latin replaced the Celtiberian language, though inscriptions in the Celtiberian script survive from this period, preserving a glimpse of their linguistic heritage. Yet even as Romanization progressed, elements of Celtiberian culture endured, influencing the identity of the region. The distinctive short sword, known to the Romans as the gladius hispaniensis, became standard issue for Roman legionaries, a testament to the effectiveness of Celtiberian weapon design. Their tactics, emphasizing speed, mobility, and knowledge of the terrain, left an impression on Roman military thought. The story of the Celtiberians also underscores a recurring theme in the history of the Celtic world: the tension between local independence and the pressures of larger, more centralized powers. In Iberia, as in Gaul and Britain later on, the combination of strong tribal identities, warrior traditions, and challenging terrain made conquest difficult, even for a disciplined and well-resourced army like Rome's. But the fragmented nature of these societies, with each tribe defending its own autonomy, often prevented the kind of unified resistance that might have altered the outcome. The Roman conquest of Celtiberia did not bring an immediate end to conflict in the Iberian Peninsula. Other peoples, such as the Lusitanians in the west, continued to resist for decades. However, the fall of Numantia sent a clear message. The Republic had the patience and resources to overcome even the most determined resistance. In the long run, this would pave the way for the transformation of the entire peninsula into the Roman provinces of Hispania. From the windswept highlands of central Iberia, our story now turns back toward the heartlands of Gaul, where Celtic societies were experiencing their own transformations in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. It was there, in the prosperous Oppida, and through the networks of trade and alliances, that the next great chapter in Celtic history was being written. a chapter that would bring them into direct and decisive confrontation with Julius Caesar. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Celtic world in Gaul was undergoing a transformation. The fragmented chiefdoms and warrior bands of earlier centuries were giving way to more complex political structures, new forms of settlement, and a web of trade that connected the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. This was a period of prosperity, innovation, and shifting alliances, one that set the stage for the dramatic arrival of Julius Caesar and the Roman legions in the mid-1st century before the Common Era. Geographically, Gaul, as understood by ancient writers, encompassed a vast area. To the south, the region was bounded by the Mediterranean coast, to the east by the Alps and the Upper Rhine, to the north by the English Channel, and to the west by the Atlantic Ocean. Within this expanse lived dozens of tribal groups, each with its own territory, leadership, and traditions. Some of these tribes formed loose federations, while others acted independently or even as rivals. Roman authors, particularly Caesar himself, would later categorize these peoples into broad divisions: the Celtae in the center, the Belgae in the north, and the Aquitani in the southwest. However, these divisions were more linguistic and cultural generalizations than fixed political realities. The most striking development of this period was the rise of the oppida, large fortified settlements that served as economic, political, and sometimes religious centers. These oppida were far larger and more organized than the hill forts of earlier times. They could cover hundreds of acres with defensive walls, gates, planned streets, and areas for craft production. Examples such as Bebracte in the territory of the Aedui, Alesia in that of the Mandubii, and Gergovia in the land of the Arverni illustrate the sophistication of these sites. The emergence of oppida was closely linked to expanding trade networks. By this time, Gaul was integrated into the Mediterranean economy through a combination of overland routes and river systems. The Rhône and Saône rivers provided access to the Mediterranean world, while the Seine and Loire connected to the Atlantic trade. From the south came wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and luxury goods from Italy and beyond. From Gaul flowed raw materials such as grain, salt, metals, and slaves. Archaeological finds of Italian amphorae, large ceramic vessels used to transport wine, at inland oppida demonstrate the scale of this trade. The influx of Mediterranean goods was not simply a matter of luxury for the elite. It played a role in politics and alliance building. Tribal leaders who could control trade routes or act as intermediaries in exchanges between Mediterranean merchants and inland communities gained prestige and influence. This economic power often translated into military and diplomatic power as well. Politically, many of the larger tribes in Gaul operated as federations of smaller communities, each with its own local leaders but united under a paramount chief or council for certain purposes. The Aedui, for example, were a powerful federation in central Gaul that cultivated ties with Rome even before Caesar's campaigns. Their rivals, the Sequani, controlled key routes in eastern Gaul and often sought alliances with other tribes or external powers to check Aeduan influence. In the south, the Arverni had once been among the most dominant tribes, but their power had been curtailed after a war with Rome in the early 2nd century before the Common Era. The political landscape of Gaul was thus one of constant maneuvering. Alliances could shift quickly, and disputes over territory, trade, or honor could erupt into war. Warfare in this period was not limited to small skirmishes. Tribal coalitions could field large armies, and leaders were judged by their ability to command warriors, distribute plunder, and protect their people. Yet this same political fragmentation would prove a vulnerability when confronted with the disciplined, centralized military power of Rome. Culturally, Gaul in the late pre-Roman period was vibrant and diverse. Artisans produced finely decorated metalwork, pottery, and textiles, often blending local styles with influences from the Mediterranean. Coinage became increasingly common, with tribes minting their own silver and bronze coins. These coins sometimes imitated Greek or Roman designs, but more often featured abstract or symbolic imagery meaningful within Celtic culture. The spread of coinage indicates a growing complexity in economic transactions and a move toward monetized trade in some areas. Religious life continued to center on sacred groves, rivers, and other natural sites, as well as constructed sanctuaries. Druids, religious specialists known for their roles as judges, teachers, and keepers of tradition, likely played a significant part in maintaining cultural cohesion across the diverse tribes of Gaul. While our knowledge of the Druids comes mostly from later Roman accounts, it is probable that they acted as important mediators in disputes and as preservers of oral law and history. The late 2nd and early 1st centuries before the Common Era also brought Gaul into closer and sometimes more hostile contact with Rome. Roman involvement in southern Gaul intensified after the defeat of the Arverni-led coalition at the Battle of the Isère River in the year 121 before the Common Era. This victory allowed Rome to establish the province of Gallia Narbonensis in the Mediterranean coastal region, providing a foothold for further influence. From this base, Rome could intervene in the affairs of neighboring tribes, often under the pretext of aiding allies or protecting trade. One notable episode occurred in the early 1st century before the Common Era, when the Helvetii, a large confederation from what is now Switzerland, began preparing for a mass migration westward. Pressured by Germanic incursions and seeking new lands, the Helvetii planned to move through Gaul to settle in the Atlantic regions. Their movements alarmed many tribes, including the Aedui, who appealed to Rome for assistance. This chain of events would eventually draw Caesar into Gaul in the year 58 before the Common Era, but the underlying dynamics, tribal rivalries, migrations, and Roman opportunism, had been building for decades. By the time Caesar arrived, Gaul was a land of contrasts. On one hand, it was wealthy, interconnected, and home to impressive settlements and skilled artisans. On the other, it was politically divided, with deep-seated rivalries that could be exploited by an ambitious external power. The Oppida stood as symbols of strength and sophistication, but they were also fixed targets for siege warfare, something at which the Romans excelled. In the years immediately preceding Caesar's campaigns, Gaul's most powerful leaders were already maneuvering for advantage. The Aedui sought to maintain their position as Rome's favored allies, while the Sequani courted Germanic support under the warlord Ariovistus to challenge Aeduan dominance. Smaller tribes chose sides based on their own interests, creating a volatile balance of power. This was the Gaul that Caesar would encounter, a land rich in resources, strategically located, and filled with fiercely independent peoples. It was also a land whose internal divisions could be turned to Rome's advantage. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape not only Gaul, but also the Roman Republic itself, providing Caesar with the military glory that would propel him to unprecedented political heights. When Julius Caesar crossed into Gaul in the year 58 before the Common Era, he came as both a Roman general and a politician seeking military glory. Gaul at this time was divided among dozens of tribal polities, wealthy, populous, and sophisticated, but bound together only by shifting alliances and rivalries. Rome already controlled the Mediterranean coastal strip of Gallia Narbonensis, and Caesar's initial pretext for intervention was to defend Rome's allies from external threats. Yet over the next 8 years, his campaigns would expand far beyond this original mission, culminating in the destruction of independent Celtic power on the continent. The immediate trigger for Caesar's first campaign was the planned migration of the Helvetii. This confederation, inhabiting the region of modern Switzerland, decided to abandon their lands and move west to settle near the Atlantic coast. Their route would take them through territories allied to Rome, including the Aedui. Caesar, claiming to protect these allies, blocked the Helveti's passage at the Saône River and inflicted a decisive defeat upon them. The survivors were forced to return to their homeland, and Caesar had established himself as a decisive actor in Gallic affairs. From there, Caesar turned his attention to another major power shift in eastern Gaul. The Germanic warlord Ariovistus had been invited by the Sequani years earlier to aid them against the Aedui, but he had since entrenched himself as a dominant force, exacting tribute and bringing in more Germanic settlers. Caesar confronted Ariovistus near Vesontio, defeating him and driving his forces back across the Rhine. This secured Rome's position in eastern Gaul and presented Caesar as the defender of Gallic freedom, though it was a freedom increasingly subject to Roman direction. Over the next several years, Caesar moved systematically against different regions and coalitions. In the year 57 before the Common Era, he campaigned in Belgic Gaul, where he faced a formidable alliance of tribes including the Nervii, Atrebates, and Virimandui. The Battle of the Sabis River nearly turned into a disaster for the Romans when the Nervii launched a surprise assault, but disciplined counterattacks and the arrival of reinforcements turned the tide. Caesar's account praises the courage of the Nervii even as he describes their near-total destruction, a pattern repeated in his commentaries, where defeated foes are memorialized for their valor but eradicated as political entities. The following year saw operations along the Atlantic coast, where the Veneti, a maritime people of Brittany, challenged Roman authority. The Veneti controlled trade routes across the English Channel and relied on strong, high-sided ships well suited to the rough seas. Roman victory here required building a fleet and adapting to unfamiliar naval warfare. Once the Veneti were defeated, Caesar ordered their leaders executed and the rest of the population sold into slavery, a harsh measure meant to deter further rebellion. In 55 before the Common Era, Caesar crossed both the Rhine and the English Channel. His brief incursion into Germanic territory was intended as a show of force rather than a conquest, demonstrating Rome's ability to project power beyond Gaul. The expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 were similarly limited, but they provided valuable intelligence and disrupted potential alliances between Britons and Gauls. In his second British expedition, Caesar fought against the forces of Cassivellaunus, securing hostages before returning to Gaul for the winter. The most serious challenge to Roman control came in 52 before the Common Era, when a broad coalition of Gallic tribes united under the leadership of Vercingetorix, a nobleman of the Arverni. Recognizing that direct confrontation with Roman legions often ended in disaster, Vercingetorix adopted a strategy of avoiding pitched battles, burning crops, and fortifying strongholds to starve the Romans of supplies. This scorched earth policy forced Caesar to stretch his supply lines and exposed his forces to constant harassment. The decisive confrontation of this uprising came at the fortified hill town of Alesia. Caesar besieged the town by constructing an immense double line of fortifications, one facing inward to contain the defenders and another facing outward to repel any relief forces. The engineering feat was staggering. Dozens of kilometers of trenches, walls, towers, and traps built in a matter of weeks. When a massive Gallic relief army arrived, it assaulted the Roman lines from the outside while the defenders of Alesia attacked from within. For days, the fighting was intense, but Roman discipline and fortifications held. The relief force was driven off, and Vercingetorix, realizing the hopelessness of his position, surrendered. According to tradition, he rode out on horseback, circled the Roman camp, and laid his arms at Caesar's feet. The fall of Alesia marked the effective end of large-scale Gallic resistance. Although mopping up operations continued into the following year, no leader was able to rally the tribes as Vercingetorix had. Rome now had uncontested control over most of Gaul. Caesar reorganized the territory, imposing tribute, wintering legions in key locations, and fostering alliances with cooperative tribal elites. The consequences of the Gallic Wars were profound and far-reaching. For Rome, the conquest brought vast wealth in the form of tribute, slaves, and resources, as well as increased security along its northern frontier. For Caesar personally, the campaigns provided the military reputation and loyal legions that would enable his later seizure of power in the Roman civil wars. His own written account, Commentari de Bello Gallico, not only chronicled the campaigns, but also served as political propaganda, portraying him as a masterful general and Rome's protector. For the peoples of Gaul, the wars were devastating. Whole communities were destroyed, populations displaced, and traditional political structures dismantled. Romanization began almost immediately in some regions, with Latin spreading through administration, trade, and settlement by Roman veterans. Yet in rural areas and among some elites, elements of Celtic culture persisted for generations, particularly language, religious practices, and local art styles. Over time, however, these would be absorbed into a Romano-Gallic identity, marking the end of Gaul as an independent Celtic world. The fall of Gaul also marked a turning point in the broader history of the Celts. On the continent, Rome now dominated the core of the Celtic-speaking world. Only in the British Isles and in some peripheral regions like Ireland and parts of northern Spain did Celtic societies remain politically independent. These would be the next frontiers for Rome's expansion, and in the case of Britain, the story would unfold within a generation of Caesar's own death. When Julius Caesar first crossed the English Channel in the mid-1st century before the Common Era, his goal was not full conquest, but reconnaissance. Britain, at that time, was outside the direct control of Rome, inhabited by numerous tribal kingdoms speaking insular Celtic languages related to those of Gaul. Caesar's brief expeditions in the years 55 and 54 before the Common Era provided him with intelligence, political hostages, and prestige in Rome, but the island remained beyond the empire's borders for nearly a century afterward. In those intervening decades, Britain developed in ways that both mirrored and diverged from the continent. Trade with Roman Gaul increased, particularly in luxury goods such as wine, fine pottery, and metalware. Certain tribal leaders cultivated ties with Rome, sometimes minting coins that bore Latin inscriptions or designs influenced by Roman imagery. Yet Britain's political landscape was still dominated by independent rulers whose rivalries shaped the balance of power. The full-scale Roman invasion came under Emperor Claudius in the year 43 of the Common Era. The official pretext was to support a political ally, Verica, king of the Atrebates, who had been deposed by rivals. In reality, the campaign was part of Claudius's broader strategy to secure military success and reinforce imperial authority at home. 4 Roman legions, supported by auxiliaries and a naval fleet, crossed the Channel and landed in the southeast. Initial resistance from the Catuvelauni, led by Togodumnus's adversaries Caratacus and his brother Togodumnus, slowed the advance, but the Roman forces steadily pushed inland. A decisive engagement near the river Medway allowed the Romans to break the main Catuvelonian resistance. Togodumnus was killed and Caratacus retreated westward. Claudius himself arrived in Britain to oversee the capture of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, which became the first Roman colonia, or settlement for retired legionaries on the island. The symbolism was clear. Rome was here to stay. Caratacus, however, did not vanish from the historical stage. Retreating into the territory of the Silures and Ordovices in modern Wales, he continued to resist Roman rule for nearly a decade. His skillful use of the mountainous terrain allowed him to win victories against Roman forces and to rally local support. Eventually, though, he was betrayed, captured, and taken to Rome. There, in a calculated display of imperial magnanimity, Claudius spared his life after Caratacus delivered a speech reportedly marveling at the wealth of the empire and questioning why such a people coveted the poor lands of Britain. Roman expansion into Wales proved difficult and prolonged. The Silures in particular fought fiercely, requiring sustained military campaigns under governors such as Publius Ostorius Scapula. Forts, roads, and supply lines were built to support these efforts, gradually bringing the region under Roman control. The mountainous and forested landscapes that had aided resistance were now integrated into a network of garrisons designed to prevent further uprisings. The most famous revolt of the Roman period in Britain came in the year 60 or 61 of the Common Era, led by Boudica, queen of the Iceni. Her husband, Prasutagus, had been a client king allied to Rome. Upon his death, the Romans annexed his kingdom, confiscated property, and reportedly abused members of the royal family. These actions, combined with heavy taxation and resentment of Roman rule, sparked a rebellion that spread rapidly. Boudica's forces destroyed Camulodunum, burned Londinium, and sacked Verulamium, killing tens of thousands of Romans and local inhabitants loyal to the empire. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning in Wales at the time, but marched quickly to confront the rebels. In a pitched battle, its location still debated, Roman discipline and tactics prevailed against the larger but less organized rebel army. Boudica either took her own life or died soon afterward, and the revolt collapsed. Following the Boudiccan uprising, Rome invested heavily in consolidating its position. Towns were rebuilt, and new administrative centers established. Londinium, in particular, grew into a major port and commercial hub, linking Britain directly to trade routes across the empire. Roads radiated outward from these centers, facilitating the movement of troops, goods, and information. By the late 1st century of the Common Era, Roman forces had pushed deep into northern Britain. Governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola, serving from the year 77 to 84, campaigned into Scotland, defeating a coalition of tribes at the Battle of Mons Graupius. Despite this victory, Rome did not fully occupy the northern highlands. The logistical challenges and limited economic return of holding these territories eventually led to the establishment of a more permanent frontier further south. This frontier was marked, in the early 2nd century, by Hadrian's Wall, a massive stone and turf fortification stretching across the width of northern Britain. Built during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, the wall was both a defensive structure and a statement of imperial power. Forts and mile castles housed garrisons, while gates controlled movement of people and goods. A generation later, the Antonine Wall was constructed further north in Scotland, but it was occupied for only a short time before the frontier returned to Hadrian's Wall. Roman Britain was a province of contrasts. In the southeast and along major roads, Roman-style towns flourished, complete with forums, baths, temples, and amphitheaters. Villas, country estates owned by wealthy landowners, produced agricultural surplus and displayed mosaics, imported goods, and other signs of Romanized elite culture. In rural and upland areas, however, many communities retained pre-Roman ways of life, adapting selectively to imperial rule. Religion in Roman Britain was a blend of traditions. The Romans introduced their pantheon of gods and goddesses, but Celtic deities continued to be worshipped, often in syncretic forms. For example, the Celtic healing god Nodens was identified with the Roman Mars or Silvanus, and Sulis, a goddess associated with the hot springs at Bath, was linked to the Roman Minerva. Temples and shrines dedicated to these combined figures show the adaptability of religious life under empire. Over nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule, the Latin language made inroads, especially in administration, the army, and urban centers. Yet the native Brittonic Celtic language remained widely spoken, evolving into the later Welsh, Cornish, and Breton tongues. The process of cultural integration was uneven. Some regions embraced Roman lifestyles and fashions, while others maintained a more visibly Celtic identity. Roman Britain was not isolated from the broader empire. Troops from across the Roman world served in its garrisons, and British soldiers were stationed as far away as the Middle East. Goods flowed in and out, from Spanish olive oil to North African pottery. The province also played a role in imperial politics, as seen when the usurper Carausius declared himself emperor in Britain in the late 3rd century, before eventually being defeated. The end of Roman Britain came gradually in the early 5th century. Pressures from barbarian incursions, internal instability, and the withdrawal of legions to defend other parts of the empire left the province increasingly vulnerable. By around the year 410, Roman administration had effectively ended, and local leaders were left to fend for themselves. Yet, the legacy of Rome remained, in its towns, roads, and the fusion of Celtic and Roman traditions that would shape the island's subsequent history. The Roman conquest of Gaul and Britain did not simply redraw political boundaries. It transformed the cultural, religious, and social order of the Celtic world. For centuries, Celtic societies had been organized around tribal structures, warrior aristocracies, and an oral tradition maintained by religious and legal specialists, most famously the Druids. Under Roman rule, many of these traditions were either suppressed, adapted, or absorbed into new forms that reflected the realities of life within an empire. The Druids occupied a unique place in Celtic society before the arrival of Rome. According to accounts from writers such as Julius Caesar, they served as priests, judges, teachers, and keepers of collective memory. They presided over religious rituals, mediated disputes, and maintained an oral body of knowledge that included law, history, and cosmology. Their training was said to take many years, often involving memorization of vast amounts of material. Druids were also believed to wield political influence, advising kings and chieftains and at times coordinating action among different tribes. To the Romans, such a class of leaders posed a potential threat. Druids were not tied to a single tribe, but moved across tribal boundaries, which meant they could help unify resistance against imperial authority. Moreover, their role as interpreters of law and tradition challenged Rome's own legal and administrative systems. The Druids' association with practices viewed by Romans as barbaric, such as human sacrifice, though the scale and nature of such rites remain debated, provided an additional pretext for suppression. The campaign against the Druids was especially visible in Britain. Roman writers record that the island of Mona, known today as Anglesey, was a stronghold of Druidic tradition. In the year 61 of the Common Era, the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus led a campaign to subdue Mona as part of his broader effort to pacify Wales. Tacitus describes how the Romans crossed the strait to find the Druids assembled with warriors and women, calling down curses upon the invaders. The Roman legions advanced, cut down the defenders, and destroyed the sacred groves. Whether or not this account is embellished, it illustrates the symbolic importance of striking at the heart of Druidic authority. In Gaul, the suppression of the Druids seems to have been a gradual process. Augustus is said to have forbidden Roman citizens from taking part in Druidic practices, while later emperors such as Claudius reportedly banned the Druids outright. By integrating local elites into the Roman administrative framework and offering them citizenship, the empire eroded the social base on which Druidic authority rested. Over time, the Druids' political role diminished, and their religious functions were either replaced by Roman cults or adapted into local practices that could coexist with imperial religion. The weakening of the Druids was part of a larger process of Romanization. In the cities and towns established or expanded under Roman rule, Latin became the language of administration, commerce, and public life. In Gaul, Latin gradually displaced the native Celtic languages, especially in urban centers and along major trade routes. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, Gaulish was already in decline, surviving mainly in rural areas. In Britain, the spread of Latin was slower and less complete. The Brittonic language continued alongside Latin, particularly outside the main towns and military zones. Roman law was another transformative element. Before the conquest, Celtic societies relied on customary law transmitted orally, often mediated by Druids or local chieftains. Disputes were settled through compensation, oaths, and sometimes ritual acts. Under Roman rule, provincial law courts operated according to written statutes presided over by officials appointed by the imperial administration. This did not entirely erase local customs. Rome often allowed a degree of legal pluralism, especially in minor civil matters. But it introduced a standardized legal framework that reinforced imperial authority. Urban life was perhaps the most visible marker of Romanization. The oppida of the late pre-Roman period provided a foundation for new Roman towns, which were laid out with streets, forums, baths, temples, and amphitheaters. These cities became administrative hubs where taxes were collected, justice was administered, and trade was regulated. In Gaul, cities such as Lugdunum, Modern Lyon, Augustodunum, Autumn, and Lutetia, Paris, emerged as major centers of commerce and governance. In Britain, Londinium, Camulodunum, and Verulamium played similar roles. The cities were also vehicles for cultural exchange. Roman architectural styles, engineering techniques, and public amenities, such as aqueducts and sewage systems, were introduced. Temples in these cities often housed deities that combined Roman and Celtic aspects, reflecting both the persistence of local religious traditions and their adaptation to the imperial framework. A visitor to such a temple might see a statue of a Celtic river god adorned with Roman armor, or inscriptions dedicating offerings to deities under dual names. Economic life under Rome was tied to these urban centers, but extended deep into the countryside. Roman taxation encouraged the development of larger agricultural estates, some owned by Roman settlers, others by local elites who adopted Roman lifestyles. The villa system, with its mosaic floors, hypocaust heating, and decorative gardens, became a hallmark of wealthy rural life. At the same time, small farms and villages continued to operate, supplying both local needs and the markets of the cities. Roman military presence also contributed to cultural integration. In Gaul, legions were stationed primarily along the Rhine frontier, while in Britain, garrisons dotted the landscape from the southeast to the northern frontiers. Many auxiliary units were recruited from other parts of the empire, bringing a diversity of languages and customs. Veterans who settled in the provinces often married local women and raised families that blended Roman and Celtic traditions. Education and literacy expanded under Roman influence. While pre-Roman Celtic societies were largely non-literate, the use of Latin script became common in inscriptions, legal documents, and trade records. In Gaul, inscriptions in both Latin and Gaulish appear in the early centuries after the conquest, suggesting a period of bilingualism before Latin became dominant. In Britain, Latin inscriptions were often associated with the military and administration, but some evidence suggests literacy extended into civilian life in certain towns. The combined effects of these changes created a Romano-Celtic culture, particularly in Gaul, where the fusion was deep and long-lasting. Celtic art forms evolved under Roman influence, blending curvilinear motifs with classical styles. Local elites participated in imperial politics, with some serving as senators or governors in distant provinces. Over time, the distinctions between Roman and Celt blurred in daily life, even as memories of pre-Roman traditions persisted in folklore, rural customs, and linguistic survivals. Yet this integration was never absolute. In more remote areas, especially in the western and northern fringes of the provinces, traditional ways endured. Some communities remained only lightly touched by urbanization, and Celtic languages and customs survived there for centuries. This uneven pattern of Romanization meant that when the empire's power began to wane, older cultural elements could reassert themselves. By the 4th century of the Common Era, Christianity had begun to spread through the western provinces, introducing another layer of change to the religious landscape once dominated by Druids and Roman polytheism. In Gaul, bishops emerged as important local leaders, sometimes taking on civic responsibilities once managed by Roman officials. In Britain, Christian communities coexisted with lingering pagan practices until the end of Roman rule. The decline of imperial authority in the 5th century would test the durability of the Romano-Celtic synthesis. In Gaul, new kingdoms formed under Germanic rulers, while in Britain, local leaders navigated a fragmented political world without Roman armies or governors. The next phase of Celtic history would unfold in regions outside the direct reach of Rome, places where Celtic languages and traditions had developed along different paths, such as Ireland, which had never been conquered. While Gaul and Britain were reshaped under Roman rule, Ireland developed along a markedly different path. Never conquered by Rome, the island's social, political, and cultural life evolved without the direct imposition of imperial law, urbanization, or Latin as the language of administration. Yet Ireland was far from isolated. Across the Irish Sea, there were steady contacts with Roman Britain, and archaeological finds of Roman goods, coins, pottery, glassware testify to trade, gift exchange, and possibly mercenary service. This unique position allowed Ireland to maintain a distinctive Celtic identity into the early medieval period, even as it gradually absorbed new influences, particularly with the arrival of Christianity. In the centuries when Rome ruled Britain, Ireland was organized into a patchwork of small kingdoms known in Irish as tuatha. Each tuath was headed by a king, whose authority was based on kinship ties, control of land, and the ability to protect and reward followers. These kingdoms were often in competition, forming alliances, waging war, and negotiating marriages to secure influence. Above the local level, some kings sought to establish themselves as over-kings, exercising authority over multiple tuatha, though such dominance was often contested. The Irish legal system, later recorded in the early medieval law tracts known as the Brehon Laws, was rooted in oral tradition. These laws regulated matters such as landholding, inheritance, contracts, compensation for injury, and the status of different social classes. The Brehons, or judges, were hereditary legal specialists who memorized vast bodies of precedent. Justice in this system was not enforced by a central state, but relied on compensation and sureties, ensuring that disputes could be resolved without constant blood feuding, though warfare between rival groups was still common. In terms of material culture, Ireland in the late prehistoric and early historic periods retained many elements of the broader Celtic world. Fine metalwork, especially in gold, bronze, and later silver, displayed intricate designs echoing Latin art but developed into distinct insular styles. Brooches, sword fittings, and decorative mounts were crafted with spirals, triscles, and interlace patterns that would later flourish in illuminated manuscripts. Farming formed the economic base, with cattle being the primary measure of wealth and status. Ownership of large herds signified power, and raiding for cattle was a common feature of inter-kingdom conflict, later immortalized in epic tales such as the Tène Bo Cuailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. Ireland's oral tradition was not limited to law. Poets and storytellers, known as filiad, were central figures in the preservation and transmission of history, genealogy, and myth. Their role was both artistic and political, as praise poems could enhance a king's reputation while satire could damage it. The filiad were part of a learned class that also included historians and musicians, forming a cultural elite that paralleled the Druids of earlier Celtic societies. Though by the time our evidence becomes clearer, the Druidic institution in Ireland was evolving under new religious influences. The most transformative of these influences was the arrival of Christianity. The traditional narrative, shaped by later hagiography, centers on St. Patrick, a Romano-British missionary active in the 5th century of the Common Era. According to his own writings, Patrick had been kidnapped as a youth and enslaved in Ireland, later escaping and returning to his family before feeling a divine call to return as a missionary. His Confessio describes his efforts to convert the Irish, baptize new Christians, and challenge pagan practices. Patrick was not the first Christian presence in Ireland. Evidence suggests that there were already Christians in the south and east of the island before his mission, but his work was particularly influential in establishing organized communities and native clergy. Conversion in Ireland did not follow the urban-centered pattern seen in the Roman world, since the island had no cities in the classical sense. Instead, Christianity spread through royal courts and aristocratic households, with kings and their retinues often converting together. The Christian church in Ireland quickly adapted to the island's decentralized political landscape. Monasteries became the primary centers of religious, intellectual, and artistic life. These monasteries were not only places of prayer, but also hubs of economic activity, education, and manuscript production. By the 6th and 7th centuries, monasteries such as Clonmacnoise, Kells, and Iona, the latter founded by the Irish monk Columba in Scotland, had become influential both within Ireland and abroad. The monastic movement brought literacy to Ireland, as Latin became the language of scripture, theology, and learning. Monks copied biblical texts and commentaries, but they also recorded native law, genealogies, and oral traditions, preserving elements of pre-Christian culture in written form. The synthesis of Celtic artistic motifs with Christian themes produced the distinctive insular art style, visible in illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells and in elaborately decorated metalwork such as the Ardagh chalice. Irish monasteries were not inward-looking. They trained missionaries who traveled to Britain and the continent, playing a significant role in the Christianization of parts of Scotland, northern England, and even regions as far afield as modern France, Germany, and Italy. Figures like Columbanus, who founded monasteries in Gaul and Lombardy, carried Irish monastic practices into the heart of early medieval Europe. Despite the spread of Christianity, elements of earlier belief systems persisted, often blending with the new religion. Sacred sites such as wells and groves were reinterpreted within a Christian framework, and seasonal festivals like Samhain and Imbolc continued to be observed, though often with Christian associations layered over them. The integration of old and new created a religious culture that was distinctly Irish, while firmly connected to the wider Christian world. By the early medieval period, Ireland had become a land of many kings, powerful monasteries, and a vibrant intellectual life. The absence of Roman conquest meant that Latin culture was adopted selectively, without the imposition of imperial administration or urbanism. This allowed Irish society to retain its kinship-based political structure and much of its native legal tradition, even as it participated in the religious and scholarly networks of Christian Europe. The distinctiveness of Ireland's development would have far-reaching consequences. In the centuries to come, Irish monasteries would serve as repositories of classical and Christian learning during times when much of Europe was facing political instability. At the same time, Ireland's independence from imperial rule meant that it would navigate its own path through the Viking Age, the rise of high kingship, and the eventual arrival of new external powers. In the centuries following the withdrawal of Roman authority from Britain in the early 5th century of the Common Era, the political map of the British Isles changed rapidly. Roman Britain, once organized into provinces under imperial administration, fragmented into a mosaic of small kingdoms and shifting alliances. Into this already unstable environment came waves of new settlers and invaders from the continent, most notably the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. As these Germanic-speaking peoples established themselves in eastern and southern Britain, many of the native Brittonic-speaking communities faced increasing pressure, both militarily and culturally. One of the most significant outcomes of this upheaval was the migration of Brittonic-speaking peoples across the English Channel to the Armorican Peninsula, the region we now call Brittany. This migration did not happen in a single wave, but over several generations, beginning in the 5th century and continuing into the 6th. The reasons for the movement were complex. Warfare and displacement in Britain played a major role, but trade, family connections, and the search for political opportunity also drew people across the sea. Armorica was not an empty land awaiting settlement. Before the Brittonic migrations, it had been part of the late Roman province of Gallia Lugdunensis and was home to a mixture of Gallo-Roman communities and remnants of earlier Celtic populations. The region had experienced its own share of instability during the waning years of the Western Roman Empire, including raids by seaborne groups and the gradual decline of centralized administration. This meant that, in many places, local elites exercised considerable autonomy, making it easier for newcomers to establish themselves. The Brittonic settlers brought with them their language, which over time evolved into Breton, the only Celtic language to survive on the European mainland into the modern era. Linguistic evidence shows that Breton is closely related to Cornish and Welsh, confirming that its origins lay in the southwest of Britain. These settlers also brought aspects of their social and political organization, establishing small kingdoms or regna that often corresponded to the territories of particular migrating groups. One important feature of this migration was the role of Christianity. Many of the migrants were already Christian, and clerics often accompanied them, founding monasteries and churches in their new homeland. These religious leaders, later venerated as saints, played a central role in shaping the identity of the Breton communities. Figures such as Saint Samson of Dole, Saint Paul Aurelian, and Saint Brieuc were credited with establishing bishoprics and centers of learning, as well as performing miracles that reinforced their reputations and the prestige of the settlements they led. The monastic foundations established by these saints served both spiritual and practical functions. They were places of worship, centers of education, and hubs of agricultural production. They also provided legitimacy to local rulers, who often patronized the monasteries in return for the moral and cultural authority the church could lend to their reign. The intertwining of royal and ecclesiastical power in early Brittany mirrored patterns seen elsewhere in post-Roman Europe, but the Breton case was distinctive for the persistence of Celtic cultural elements within this framework. The political landscape of early Brittany was fragmented. Small kingdoms, often associated with the name of a founding leader, competed for dominance, sometimes allying with or opposing the Frankish rulers to the east. The Franks, who had established the powerful Merovingian dynasty in what is now France, viewed Brittany as both a frontier and a potential source of tribute or military support. Breton leaders, for their part, sought to maintain autonomy while navigating the reality of Frankish power. Conflicts between the Bretons and the Franks are recorded in several early medieval sources. At times, Frankish kings launched campaigns to assert control over the peninsula, with varying degrees of success. The rugged terrain of Brittany, combined with the mobility of its warriors, made outright conquest difficult. Even when Breton rulers acknowledged Frankish overlordship, they often retained considerable independence in local affairs. This autonomy allowed Breton law, language, and customs to develop in relative continuity with their Brittonic roots. Culturally, the migration reinforced Armorica's Celtic heritage. While Latin had been the language of administration during the Roman period, the arrival of Brittonic speakers shifted the linguistic balance in many areas. Breton gradually became the dominant spoken language in much of the peninsula, though Latin remained important for religious and scholarly purposes. Place names from this period reflect the blending of traditions, with some preserving older Gallo-Roman elements and others clearly derived from Brittonic roots. The migration also brought with it a rich oral tradition. Stories of heroes, saints, and legendary ancestors were told and retold, blending memory with myth. Some of these tales connected the Bretons to the wider cycle of Brittonic legend, including associations with Arthurian traditions that would later spread across Europe. While the historical accuracy of such connections is debated, their cultural significance is clear. They linked the Bretons to a heroic past and distinguished them from their Frankish and Gallo-Roman neighbors. Economically, early medieval Brittany relied on a mixture of agriculture, animal husbandry, and maritime activity. The coastal position of the peninsula facilitated fishing, salt production, and trade with both the British Isles and continental Europe. Breton merchants and sailors were active in the Channel and beyond, sometimes engaging in peaceful exchange and at other times in raiding, a pattern not uncommon in the turbulent early medieval seas. By the end of the 6th century, Brittany had firmly established itself as a distinct cultural and political region. It was Christian, but its church maintained close ties to the insular Celtic world. It was politically fragmented, yet its rulers shared a language and heritage that set them apart from the Frankish kingdoms. The survival of Breton as a living Celtic language on the continent was a direct result of this migration, and it ensured that Armorica would remain a part of the broader Celtic world, even as most of that world was being transformed under new powers. In the centuries to come, Brittany would face pressures from both east and sea. The Franks would continue to seek control over the peninsula, while new waves of maritime raiders from Scandinavia would challenge Breton independence. Yet the foundations laid by the Brittonic migration, the language, the saints, the political structures, would endure through these trials. By the closing decades of the 8th century of the Common Era, the Celtic-speaking regions of the Irish Sea were entering a new and turbulent chapter. Across the northern seas, Scandinavian societies, often grouped together as Vikings in modern terms, were undergoing their own period of expansion, driven by a mixture of factors: population growth, political consolidation at home, and the lure of wealth abroad. The Celtic lands, with their rich monasteries, strategic ports, and extensive coasts, became natural targets for these maritime raiders. The first recorded Viking raid on Irish shores took place in the final years of the 8th century, when Norse longships struck at a monastery on the island of Rathlin. This was followed by increasingly frequent attacks on coastal settlements and monastic sites, including the famous sack of Iona in the year 806, in which a large number of monks were killed. For the Norse, these monasteries were appealing targets. They often held silver and gold liturgical objects, stored food supplies, and were relatively undefended. At first, Norse activity in Ireland and the surrounding regions took the form of seasonal raids. Fleets would arrive in the warmer months, plunder, and then return to Scandinavia with their spoils. However, by the mid-9th century, this pattern began to change. The Vikings established permanent or semi-permanent bases known in Irish sources as longfort, literally ship forts. These were fortified encampments located at river mouths or sheltered bays, allowing easy access inland by water. From these bases, the Norse could conduct raids more efficiently and also engage in trade. One of the earliest and most significant of these settlements was Dublin, founded as a Viking base around the year 841. Over time, Dublin developed into a major urban center, functioning as both a hub of commerce and a stronghold for Norse power in Ireland. Other key settlements included Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. These towns became nodes in a network connecting Ireland to the wider Viking world, which stretched from the North Atlantic islands to the Baltic and even into the river systems of Russia. The relationship between the Norse and the Celtic-speaking peoples of Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man was complex. Initially characterized by violent conflict, it gradually evolved into something more nuanced. Norse rulers often allied with Irish kings against their rivals, married into local dynasties, and adopted elements of Gaelic culture. The result was the emergence of Norse-Gaelic communities, blending Scandinavian and Gaelic languages, customs, and identities. In the Hebrides and parts of mainland Scotland, Norse settlement was extensive, particularly in the northern and western Isles. Here, Scandinavian place names became common, and Norse law and landholding practices influenced local governance. Yet Gaelic remained a vital language, and over generations, the descendants of Norse settlers often became culturally indistinguishable from their Gaelic neighbors, even while preserving certain Scandinavian traditions. The political landscape of Ireland during the Viking Age was already fragmented into numerous rival kingdoms, each ruled by its own re. The arrival of the Norse added a new dimension to this competition. Some Irish kings sought to expel the foreigners entirely, while others saw them as useful allies or vassals. One of the most prominent figures of this era was Brian Boru, a king of Munster who rose to the title of High King of Ireland in the late 10th century. Brian Boru's career illustrates both the opportunities and the perils of the Norse Gaelic world. In his early years, he fought against Norse forces in Limerick, eventually taking the city and incorporating it into his power base. He also forged alliances with certain Norse leaders, using their fleets to project power beyond his own territories. Brian's ambition was to bring the whole island under his authority, reducing the constant inter-kingdom warfare that had long characterized Irish politics. The climax of Brian's reign came at the Battle of Clontarf in the year 1014. This confrontation, fought near Dublin, pitted Brian's forces and allies against a coalition that included the Norse of Dublin, the Leinster Kingdom, and Norsemen from the Isle of Man and the Orkneys. The battle was bloody and decisive. Brian's forces were victorious, but he himself was killed, along with many of his close kin. Clontarf is often portrayed as a nationalist triumph over the Vikings, but in reality, the alliances on both sides were mixed, with Norsemen fighting alongside Brian and Irish warriors fighting against him. The battle marked a turning point. While Norse political influence in Ireland declined afterward, their towns remained integral parts of the island's economy and culture. Trade was one of the most enduring legacies of the Norse presence. Viking merchants exchanged goods such as amber, walrus ivory, and furs from the north for silver, wine, and luxury items from continental Europe and the Islamic world. Dublin, in particular, became a center for the slave trade, with captives taken in raids sold to buyers across the Viking world. While morally troubling to modern eyes, slavery was a common institution in both Norse and Gaelic societies of the time. In the Isle of Man, Norse settlement left a distinctive imprint, particularly in law and governance. The island's assembly, known as the Tynwald, is often claimed to have roots in Viking legal traditions, though it also incorporated Gaelic elements. The blending of these systems reflected the broader cultural fusion taking place across the Irish Sea. Religious life during this era was marked by coexistence and gradual conversion. Many Norse settlers initially maintained their pagan beliefs, venerating gods such as Odin and Thor. But over time, Christianity spread among them, often through marriage alliances with Christian families and the influence of the church in their new homelands. By the late 10th century, most Norse Gaelic rulers were Christian, though traces of earlier pagan practices can still be found in archaeology and folklore. Art and craftsmanship in the Norse Gaelic world reflected this hybrid identity. Metalwork, stone carving, and shipbuilding all showed influences from both traditions. The high crosses of Ireland, for example, sometimes incorporated interlace patterns and animal motifs that bear a strong resemblance to Scandinavian styles. Similarly, Viking ships built in the Western Isles might feature Gaelic decorative flourishes. By the close of the 11th century, the Norse political presence in much of Ireland had been reduced, but the cultural and economic impact of the Viking Age endured. The towns founded by the Norse continued to thrive as centers of trade, governance, and learning. The maritime connections they fostered linked the Celtic world more closely to the broader North Atlantic network, setting the stage for future interactions with powers from Normandy, England, and beyond. From the Norse Gaelic era, we turn next to the processes of state formation and conquest in Scotland and Wales between the 9th and 13th centuries, a period in which Celtic polities would both consolidate their identities and face the growing power of new neighbors determined to bring them under their control. From the 9th to the 13th centuries, the Celtic-speaking lands of Scotland and Wales underwent profound political changes. These centuries saw the emergence of more centralized polities, the shaping of enduring cultural identities, and the eventual confrontation with powerful neighbors who sought to incorporate them into expanding realms. The processes of state formation in these regions were shaped by geography, dynastic ambition, and the pressures exerted by both Norse and Anglo-Norman powers. In Scotland, the origins of the medieval kingdom lay in the union of different peoples. In the early 9th century, the Picts dominated much of northern and eastern Scotland, while the Gaels of Dalriata held sway in the western Highlands and Islands. To the south were the Britons of Strathclyde, and along the eastern and northern coasts, Norse settlers and rulers had established themselves following the Viking Age. According to later tradition, the figure often credited with uniting the Picts and Gaels was Kenneth MacAlpin, who became king of both peoples in the mid-9th century. The reality behind this unification was likely a combination of dynastic inheritance, political maneuvering, and external pressures. Norse incursions may have weakened the Pictish kingdom, making union with Dalriata advantageous for mutual defense. Over time, the Gaelic language and culture became dominant in the unified kingdom, a process sometimes referred to as Gaelicization. The name Alba came into use for this realm, which would later evolve into the medieval Kingdom of Scotland. The consolidation of Alba was not instantaneous. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, Scottish kings worked to extend their authority over the lowlands and to integrate territories such as Strathclyde. Norse influence remained strong in the Northern Isles and Hebrides, areas that would not come under full Scottish control for centuries. Relations with the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England fluctuated between alliance and hostility, with occasional recognition of English overlordship in exchange for peace or military aid. By the 12th century, the Scottish monarchy was adopting many features of feudal kingship, influenced in part by marriage alliances and cultural contact with Anglo-Norman England. Kings such as David I encouraged the settlement of Norman knights, granted lands to monasteries, and promoted the foundation of burghs, towns with special trading privileges. These reforms strengthened royal authority, diversified the economy, and linked Scotland more closely to the political and cultural currents of medieval Europe, while still maintaining its Gaelic heritage in much of the countryside. In Wales, the political situation was different but equally dynamic. Following the end of Roman Britain, the Welsh kingdoms had emerged as successors to the Brittonic polities of the late Roman era. By the early medieval period, Wales was divided into several principal kingdoms, including Gwynedd in the northwest, Powys in the east, and Deheubarth in the south. These realms were often united under strong rulers, but just as often divided by dynastic rivalries. The rugged terrain of Wales provided a measure of defense against outside conquest, but it also made internal unity difficult. Nevertheless, certain rulers succeeded in asserting authority over much of Wales for a time. In the early 11th century, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn became the only ruler to unite all of Wales under his leadership, maintaining this position until his death in the year 1063. After his death, Wales once again fragmented into competing principalities. The arrival of the Normans after their conquest of England in the year 1066 introduced a new and formidable challenge. Norman lords pushed into the Welsh borderlands, establishing castles and controlling fertile lowlands. These marcher lordships, often semi-independent from the English crown, became launching points for further incursions. The Welsh princes resisted, sometimes regaining lost territories through alliances or military campaigns. But the balance of power increasingly tilted toward the Norman frontier lords. Despite these pressures, the 12th and early 13th centuries saw a resurgence of Welsh political power under leaders such as Llywelyn the Great of Gwynedd. Llywelyn skillfully navigated both war and diplomacy, securing recognition from the English crown as the paramount Prince of Wales. He consolidated his position through marriage alliances, treaties, and campaigns against rivals, laying the groundwork for a more unified Welsh polity. However, the growing might of the English monarchy in the 13th century would bring this independence to an end. Edward I, determined to bring Wales under direct royal control, launched a series of campaigns in the years 1277 and 1282. These culminated in the death of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, grandson of Llywelyn the Great, and the annexation of Wales into the English crown's possessions. Edward constructed an imposing chain of castles, such as Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech, to secure his rule, symbols of conquest that still dominate the Welsh landscape. In both Scotland and Wales, the centuries between the 9th and 13th saw the forging of political structures that blended native traditions with external influences. In Scotland, the union of Picts and Gaels created a kingdom that could interact as a peer with its neighbors while preserving its distinct cultural identity. In Wales, periods of unity alternated with division, but the enduring sense of a shared Welsh identity persisted even in the face of conquest. The legacies of these processes would shape the future struggles of both nations. Scotland's kingship would survive the Middle Ages, at times fiercely defending independence against English claims. Wales, though politically absorbed into the English realm, would maintain its language, law, and cultural traditions through centuries of adaptation and resistance. From here, the story of the Celtic world moves westward once again, to Ireland in the later Middle Ages, where the arrival of Anglo-Norman invaders in the late 12th century began a new and complex chapter in the island's history, a chapter that would eventually culminate in the Tudor conquest and the transformation of Gaelic Ireland. By the 12th century of the Common Era, Ireland was a land of many kings, complex alliances, and a political order still rooted in ancient Gaelic traditions. The island was divided into numerous tuatha, small kingdoms, grouped loosely under the authority of provincial kings in Ulster, Munster, Leinster, and Connaught. Above these, the title of High King of Ireland was claimed by rulers ambitious enough to seek supremacy, though in practice the position was often contested and rarely uncontested over the whole island. It was into this environment, vibrant but politically fragmented, that the Anglo-Normans arrived in the late 12th century, setting in motion centuries of transformation. The immediate cause of their arrival was a dynastic struggle in Leinster. Diarmait mac Murchada, king of Leinster, was deposed in the year 1166 by a coalition led by the High King, Rhuedri Ua Conchobar. Seeking to regain his throne, Diarmait fled to England, where he secured the support of King Henry II and several powerful Anglo-Norman lords. Among these was Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, who agreed to aid Diarmait in exchange for marriage to his daughter Awaf and the promise of succession to Leinster. In the year 1169, the first Anglo-Norman forces landed in Ireland. They brought with them heavily armed knights, disciplined infantry, and the formidable siege techniques developed in their campaigns across England, Wales, and Normandy. Their arrival dramatically shifted the balance of power. Within a few years, Diarmait regained Leinster, and Strongbow emerged as one of the most powerful lords in Ireland after Diarmait's death. The growing influence of these Anglo-Norman magnates prompted King Henry II to intervene directly. In the year 1171, Henry landed in Ireland with a large army, becoming the first English king to set foot on the island. His aims were to assert royal authority over his vassals, prevent Ireland from becoming a semi-independent Norman realm, and secure papal approval for English overlordship. The result was the creation of the Lordship of Ireland, with Henry as its lord under the nominal authority of the Pope. Over the next century, the Anglo-Norman presence expanded. Fortified towns and castles appeared across Leinster and Munster, serving both as military strongpoints and as centers of administration and trade. Anglo-Norman settlers introduced new agricultural practices, reorganized landholding into manorial estates, and imposed feudal obligations on tenants. The existing Gaelic order was not entirely swept aside. Many Irish lords retained control of their lands, often by negotiating alliances or intermarrying with the newcomers. But the political map of Ireland was permanently altered. By the early 14th century, however, the reach of the Anglo-Norman lordship began to contract. A combination of factors weakened English control. The Bruce invasion of Ireland from Scotland in the years 1316 to 1318, the outbreak of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, and ongoing warfare between rival Anglo-Irish magnates. In many regions, Gaelic lords regained ground, reasserting their laws, language, and customs. This Gaelic resurgence saw the revival of traditional forms of kingship and the flourishing of Gaelic culture, even in areas that had once been firmly under Anglo-Norman administration. By the 15th century, English control was largely confined to the Pale, a fortified area around Dublin and parts of eastern Leinster, while the rest of the island was dominated by powerful Gaelic and Gaelicized Anglo-Irish dynasties. The English crown still claimed authority over the entire island, but in practice, its influence was minimal beyond the Pale's borders. The Tudor monarchs of the 16th century would seek to change this, launching a determined campaign to bring all of Ireland under direct royal control. The Tudor reconquest began under Henry VIII, whose break with the papacy in the 1530s altered England's relationship with Ireland. In the year 1541, the Irish Parliament, under pressure from the Crown, declared Henry King of Ireland, replacing the old title of Lord of Ireland. This change symbolized a new phase in English policy, the shift from indirect overlordship to an assertion of sovereign authority over the entire island. One of the central strategies of the Tudors was surrender and regrant. Gaelic and Anglo-Irish lords were invited to submit to the king's authority, surrender their lands to the crown, and receive them back as freehold estates under English law. In return, they were granted English titles and expected to abandon Gaelic customs, including the system of tanistry, electing a successor from the extended royal family, and the use of Brehon law. While some lords accepted, hoping to secure their positions in a changing political order, others resisted, seeing the policy as an attack on their autonomy and culture. Religious change further complicated matters. The Protestant Reformation, imposed from England, met with little acceptance in predominantly Catholic Ireland. The Tudors viewed the island's Catholicism as both a spiritual failing and a potential political threat, particularly in light of alliances between Irish rebels and Catholic powers such as Spain. Religious difference thus became intertwined with resistance to English authority. The mid to late 16th century saw a series of major uprisings against Tudor rule, the most significant of which was the 9 Years' War, fought from 1593 to 1603. This conflict was led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, who forged a powerful alliance of Gaelic lords to resist English expansion in Ulster. The war was marked by fierce battles, shifting alliances, and foreign intervention, with Spanish troops landing at Kinsale in 1601. The decisive Battle of Kinsale ended in English victory, and O'Neill's eventual submission marked the effective completion of the Tudor conquest. In the aftermath, the English crown moved to consolidate its control. The confiscation of vast tracts of land in Ulster led to the Plantation of Ulster, in which English and Scottish settlers were established on lands taken from Gaelic lords. This policy was designed to secure loyalty to the crown, change the ethnic and religious makeup of key regions, and prevent future large-scale rebellions. The Tudor conquest thus marked a turning point in Irish history. The old Gaelic order, with its laws, language, and political autonomy, was severely weakened. English law, administration, and settlement patterns reshaped the island, while religious division deepened the gulf between rulers and much of the population. The legacy of these changes would echo for centuries, influencing the political and cultural struggles of modern Ireland. From the 16th through the 18th centuries, the Celtic regions of Western Europe were drawn ever more tightly into the orbit of expanding centralized states. The processes of union, whether through conquest, dynastic merger, or parliamentary legislation, were accompanied by waves of rebellion and by deliberate policies aimed at reshaping or even erasing older cultural and political identities. For Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, these centuries were marked by both adaptation and resistance, as local traditions confronted the realities of life under increasingly powerful English and French crowns. In Wales, the Tudor dynasty's Welsh origins did not shield the country from deep structural change. Under King Henry VIII, a series of laws passed between the year 1536 and the year 1543, often called the Laws in Wales Acts, formally incorporated Wales into the Kingdom of England. These acts abolished the Welsh legal system, replacing it with English common law, and reorganized the territory into English-style counties. Welsh representation was introduced in the English Parliament, but at the cost of political autonomy. The acts also mandated English as the sole language of administration, which diminished the official status of the Welsh language and began a long process of linguistic marginalization, though it remained strong in everyday life. Scotland's path to union was more complex. In the year 1607, the crowns of England and Scotland were united under James VI of Scotland, who also became James I of England. This was a dynastic union rather than a parliamentary one, meaning each kingdom retained its own parliament, legal system, and church. Yet political and economic pressures over the following century pushed the two realms closer. The catastrophic failure of the Darien scheme, Scotland's ill-fated colonial venture in Central America in the late 17th century, left the country financially weakened and more open to union. The Acts of Union in the year 1707 created the Kingdom of Great Britain, merging the Scottish and English parliaments. While the Union offered economic opportunities and access to colonial markets, it also sparked discontent, particularly among those who saw it as a betrayal of Scottish sovereignty. The 18th century in Scotland was also defined by the Jacobite risings, efforts to restore the exiled Stuart dynasty to the throne. These uprisings drew significant support from the Scottish Highlands, where clan society retained strong Gaelic cultural traditions. The most famous of these rebellions was the Rising of 1745, led by Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. Initially successful, the Jacobite army advanced deep into England before retreating north. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Culloden in the year 1746, where government forces decisively defeated the Jacobites. In the aftermath, the British government imposed harsh measures to break the power of the Highland clans. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act abolished the traditional authority of clan chiefs, while laws were enacted to disarm the population, ban the wearing of Highland dress, and suppress Gaelic culture. The economy and society of the Highlands were further transformed in the later 18th century by the Highland clearances, when many tenants were evicted to make way for sheep farming. This period saw large-scale emigration, with many Highland Scots settling in North America and other parts of the British Empire. Ireland's trajectory after the Tudor conquest was equally turbulent. The 17th century was dominated by cycles of rebellion, war, and plantation. The 9 Years' War at the turn of the century had already weakened Gaelic Ireland, and the subsequent plantation of Ulster brought large numbers of English and Scottish Protestant settlers into the north. The mid-century Irish Rebellion of 1641 triggered a complex series of conflicts that merged with the wider wars of the Three Kingdoms, leading to the brutal Cromwellian conquest in the 1650s. The Cromwellian settlement confiscated vast amounts of land from Catholic owners, redistributing it to Protestant soldiers and investors. Penal laws in the following decades restricted Catholic land ownership, education, and political participation, entrenching a social order that privileged the Protestant ascendancy. Attempts to reverse this order through armed struggle continued, notably in the Williamite War of the 1690s, which ended with the Treaty of Limerick. The treaty's promises of leniency for Catholics were soon undermined by further penal legislation, deepening the cultural and political marginalization of the majority population. In Brittany, the end of the Middle Ages had already brought the region under French control through the marriage of Duchess Anne of Brittany to two successive French kings in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. While Brittany retained some privileges and local institutions, it was formally incorporated into the French crown's domains in the year 1532. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, French royal authority grew stronger and Breton autonomy diminished. French became the language of administration, and the Breton language, like Welsh and Gaelic, was increasingly confined to rural life. Nonetheless, Brittany maintained a distinct cultural identity through its customs, festivals, and maritime economy. Periodic revolts, such as the Revolt of the Bonnets Rouge in the year 1675, reflected local resistance to royal taxation and centralization. Throughout these Celtic regions, the early modern period witnessed a steady erosion of the old political structures that had once sustained distinctive local identities. The suppression of native laws, the decline of Celtic languages in official contexts, and the imposition of centralized authority all contributed to a sense of cultural loss. Yet these changes also spurred forms of adaptation. In Scotland and Wales, elements of traditional culture persisted in literature, music, and oral tradition. In Ireland and Brittany, the Church often served as a guardian of language and community life, even when political autonomy was gone. The diaspora of Celtic peoples in this period was significant. Economic hardship, political repression, and the lure of opportunity abroad drove many to emigrate. Irish, Scottish, and Breton communities appeared in France, Spain, and the Americas, carrying their languages, music, and stories with them. This dispersion planted the seeds for later cultural revivals, as emigrant communities often preserved traditions that were under pressure in their homelands. By the end of the 18th century, the political map of the Celtic world had been decisively redrawn. Wales was fully integrated into the English state. Scotland was part of Great Britain. Ireland was under firm English control, and Brittany was a province of France. Yet beneath this surface of uniformity, the Celtic languages, identities, and memories of independence endured. The following century would see these memories rekindled in new ways, as Romanticism, nationalism, and cultural revival movements sought to reclaim and redefine what it meant to be Celtic in the modern age. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Celtic-speaking regions of Europe, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, Cornwall, and the Isle of Man, were politically integrated into larger states. Their languages were under pressure, their traditional laws had long been replaced by centralized systems, and their economic and political power was shaped by the priorities of London or Paris rather than by local rule. Yet the century that followed would see a remarkable revival of interest in Celtic culture, history, and identity, driven by a combination of Romanticism, emerging nationalism, scholarly research, and the determination of local communities to preserve what remained of their heritage. The early 19th century was shaped by the Romantic movement, which rejected the strict rationalism of the Enlightenment in favor of emotion, imagination, and a fascination with the past. Across Europe, Romantic writers and artists sought inspiration in folk traditions, medieval legends, and the natural landscape. For the Celtic regions, this cultural climate proved fertile ground for renewed attention. Poets, antiquarians, and historians began collecting songs, recording legends, and publishing studies of Celtic languages. Some of this work was deeply scholarly, while other parts were more imaginative or even invented, such as James Macpherson's Ossian poems, which claimed to be translations of ancient Gaelic epics, but were largely his own creations. In Wales, this period saw the re-establishment of the Eisteddfod, a traditional festival of poetry and music that had medieval roots but had fallen into decline. Revived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Eisteddfod became a showcase for Welsh literature, song, and oratory. It also helped foster a sense of national pride and community identity at a time when the Welsh language was losing ground in education and administration. The publication of Welsh language periodicals and the work of societies such as the Cymrodorion further supported the preservation and promotion of the language. Scotland experienced its own cultural revival, fueled in part by the popularity of Sir Walter Scott's historical novels and poetry. Scott's works romanticized the Highlands, their landscapes, and their clan traditions, even as the Gaelic language itself continued to decline in many areas due to the effects of the Highland clearances and economic change. The Highland Society of London and other groups worked to preserve Gaelic literature and music, while collections of folk songs and stories were published to safeguard oral traditions. In Ireland, the 19th century was a time of both tragedy and cultural awakening. The Great Famine of the 1840s devastated rural communities, caused mass emigration, and accelerated the decline of the Irish language. Yet, the latter part of the century saw the emergence of the Gaelic revival, a movement dedicated to the preservation and promotion of Irish culture. The Gaelic League, founded in 1893, encouraged the learning and use of the Irish language, organized cultural events, and supported the publication of Irish literature. Writers such as Douglas Hyde and W.B. Yeats drew on Celtic mythology and folklore to create works that were both modern and rooted in tradition. The cultural revival in Ireland was closely linked to political nationalism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed growing demands for home rule and later full independence from Britain. The revival of the Irish language and the celebration of Celtic heritage were seen as vital components of national identity, reinforcing the idea that Ireland was distinct from its colonial ruler. This intertwining of cultural and political aims set the Irish movement apart from some of the other Celtic revivals, where political separatism was less central. In Brittany, cultural revival faced particular challenges under the French state, which promoted a centralized identity and the exclusive use of the French language in schools and administration. Breton, spoken mainly in rural western Brittany, was stigmatized as a language of the countryside. Nevertheless, Breton intellectuals and clergy worked to preserve local traditions, collecting folk tales, proverbs, and songs. The publication of Breton language newspapers and the establishment of cultural associations in the late 19th century laid the groundwork for later 20th century revival efforts. Cornwall, though its language had declined almost to extinction by the late 18th century, also experienced a cultural reawakening in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Local historians and antiquarians celebrated Cornwall's distinct heritage, while early linguistic enthusiasts began the painstaking work of reconstructing the Cornish language from surviving texts and comparative evidence with related Celtic tongues. The Cornish Gorset, established in the 20th century, would build on these foundations to promote the language and culture. The Isle of Man, too, saw efforts to record and preserve its Manx Gaelic heritage. By the late 19th century, the language was in serious decline, but collections of folklore, ballads, and oral history were made by scholars and local enthusiasts. These records would prove vital for later revival movements. The 20th century brought both new challenges and new opportunities for the Celtic world. 2 world wars, economic changes, and the continuing dominance of English and French in education and media threatened the survival of the smaller Celtic languages. Yet the rise of modern communications, mass literacy, and political activism also allowed revivalists to reach broader audiences. In the post-war period, decolonization and the global spread of nationalist movements inspired renewed political aspirations in some Celtic regions. In Wales and Scotland, nationalist political parties emerged, advocating for self-government. In Brittany, cultural activism remained strong despite political suppression. In Ireland, the achievement of independence for most of the island in the early 20th century placed new responsibilities on the state to protect and promote the Irish language, though with mixed results. Devolution in the late 20th and early 21st centuries transformed the political landscape for parts of the Celtic world. The establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999 and the Welsh Senedd in 2000 gave these nations greater control over their internal affairs, including cultural policy and language promotion. In Northern Ireland, the peace process opened new space for cultural and linguistic initiatives, though often within a contested political context. Language revival movements in the modern era have combined grassroots activism with institutional support. In Wales, the introduction of Welsh medium education and the establishment of Welsh language media, such as S4C television, have contributed to a measurable increase in speakers. In Scotland, Gaelic medium schools and broadcasting have helped to stabilize numbers of Gaelic speakers, particularly in urban areas. In Ireland, Irish remains a compulsory subject in schools, and Gaeltacht regions continue to receive state support, though challenges remain in expanding the language's daily use. In Brittany, efforts to revive the Breton language have focused on immersion schools, bilingual education, and cultural festivals, often in the face of limited official recognition from the French state. In Cornwall and the Isle of Man, dedicated communities of learners, teachers, and cultural organizations have succeeded in re-establishing their languages as living mediums of communication, albeit with small numbers of fluent speakers. Celtic identity in the modern world is not solely about language. Music, dance, literature, and sport all play important roles in sustaining and expressing cultural distinctiveness. The global popularity of Celtic music, from traditional folk to contemporary fusion, has brought attention to these cultures far beyond their home regions. Annual festivals, from the Eisteddfod Fod in Wales to the Festival Interceltique in Brittany, draw participants and audiences from across the Celtic diaspora. That diaspora remains a crucial part of the modern Celtic story. Communities of Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Breton, Cornish, and Manx descent around the world maintain cultural ties through associations, events, and heritage projects. In countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and Argentina, Celtic festivals and gatherings celebrate traditions that have been adapted to new environments while keeping connections to ancestral homelands alive. Today, the Celtic world is both ancient and modern. Its languages and cultures have endured centuries of political subjugation, social change, and economic challenge. The revival movements of the past 2 centuries have transformed what it means to be Celtic from a label imposed by outsiders into a self-defined identity rooted in heritage, resilience, and creativity. The survival of these traditions into the 21st century is a testament to the determination of those who have worked to preserve them, and a reminder that cultural continuity is always an active process, requiring renewal in each generation. The story of the Celts, then, does not end in the past. It continues to evolve as communities across Europe and the wider world draw on their history to shape their future. The journey from the Iron Age heartlands of Hallstatt and Tène to the modern parliaments of Edinburgh and Cardiff, the music halls of Dublin and Brest, and the classrooms of immersion schools in Cornwall and the Isle of Man reflects both loss and survival, decline and revival. Above all, it shows that the Celtic heritage, far from being a relic, remains a living force, adaptable, diverse, and deeply woven into the human story.